Good morning, everyone. My name is Zachary Gott. I go by Kaibon the Renegade on YouTube and TikTok. I'm here to read you my audiobook for Godly Legacies, The Land of Frozen Hearts. This audiobook is free, but if you want to support my work, the best way you can do so is to buy a copy on Amazon and leave a review. So thanks so very much for joining me this morning, and I'm going to get right into it. Chapter 0, Godly, Book 2, Fire and Ice. Jacob Godly had thought himself a mostly ordinary boy until he was 14 years old. He grew up in Athens, Greece, learning, making friends, and living the life of a regular child with his best friend Damon. That was until the day the city was attacked by chimeras controlled by Chaos, a primordial god who created monsters in order to obtain a body powerful enough to conquer entire pantheons. This attack led Jacob to Mount Olympus, where he learned that he and Damon were both demigods, and they were trained to wield their divine strength. The gods taught the boys specifically to take part in a tournament designed to choose the most powerful demigod among all pantheons and hand them over to Chaos to appease him and prevent him from waging war against the pantheons using his chimera army. Little did they know, Chaos had greater plans in mind. The primordial god had hatched a scheme to create a body powerful enough to conquer every pantheon using the demigods, forcing them to procreate and produce a being known as a pure demigod. A divine child of two demigod parents. His intent being to force Jacob to have children with his half-sister Junia, who was separated from him at birth, and take their child as a body to host his mind. This pure demigod was said to have unrelenting power and stamina to outmatch even the mightiest of gods, a potent resistant to magic, and with Chaos's mind implanted inside, he would have the power and cunning necessary to usurp the pantheons and rule them all with an iron fist. Jacob and Damon found out about his scheme, and they knew there was no way they could let him succeed. So they hatched a plan of their own to gather the aid of all pantheons and form an army of the divine, hoping together they could have the power to overcome Chaos's chimera horde. Having met other demigods from nearly every pantheon in the Tournament of Champions, they'd hoped that they could gain their pantheon's aid by traveling the land and gaining as many powerful allies as they could. Jacob traveled north to recruit the Roman, Irish, and Norse pantheons, while Damon was sent east and Junia was sent west across the ocean. However, Jacob would have been remiss to admit he didn't have another reason. During the tournament, he'd met the demigod Sylvie, Freya's daughter of the Norse pantheon, and developed something of a crush on her, to put it lightly. After traveling across the countryside and arriving in the Norse god's homeland of Asgard, Jacob managed to recruit all the pantheons he'd set out to and found himself with a lot of time left to train and prepare for the upcoming war. During this time, he and Sylvie found themselves entwined in a passionate relationship that eventually resulted in my birth. Our story takes place just a few months into Jacob's stay in Asgard, when his and Sylvie's relationship was still quite new to them both. Our story starts today in Godly Legacies, The Land of Frozen Hearts. Chapter 1, Falling with You. My father, Jacob Godly, was a young man of 17 when he found himself in Asgard with his sweetheart, and eventually my mother, Sylvia, Freya's daughter. They lived in a comfortable little house in the main city of Asgard, training together every day for the time when the divine army would gather and take the fight to Chaos. Jacob was a tall young man with short, messy, straight brown hair, and deep green eyes like an emerald. On the day in question, he was wearing a long-sleeved black turtleneck sweater, light tan pants, and the bright orange scarf my mother had given him that hung down to his knees. Sylvie was an absolutely gorgeous, tall redhead with poofy, voluminous hair, soft, light blue eyes, and a light blue birthmark that rested above her left eyebrow in the shape of a circle with 5 lines stretching out of it, reminding my father of the sun. She rose from bed early in the morning to find Jacob had already gotten up, as he often did. She went and sat at her vanity and brushed her hair, smiling to herself as she watched Jacob play with her dog Scuggy from the mirror. He was begging for mercy as the black wolf dog licked him relentlessly, having taken quite a shine to Jacob in their short time together. She couldn't help but grin at him as she got up and got dressed, changing out of her nightgown into a shiny silver top that left her shoulders and midriff exposed, along with a pair of cute white pants that cut off just before her ankles. After grabbing the war axe she kept sheathed by her bedside and equipping it to her belt, she walked over to the kitchen to find Jacob rolling around on the floor with Scuggy, wrestling and getting dog hair everywhere. She couldn't help but chuckle to herself before saying, "Good morning, sugar," as sweetly as she could manage. Jacob perked up immediately as he rose and gave her a kiss on the cheek. "Good morning," he said pleasantly. "Breakfast is on the table if you're hungry." Sylvie was quite pleased to see that Jacob had gone to the trouble of cooking breakfast for them, returning his kiss before heading to the table to enjoy her meal. It was a very simple plate of scrambled eggs and toast, but she found herself impressed that Jacob had managed not to burn it this time. "This looks good," she said pleasantly, turning over the toast to ensure he hadn't hidden that it was burnt on the other side. Luckily for her, it seemed he'd finally managed to make a decent meal after months of helping him with the basics. "Thanks, I've been practicing," he said with a big smile, gesturing to the enormous pile of dishes sitting in the sink. Sylvie could only smile to herself as she buttered her toast and scooped some of the egg onto it before taking a bite. "I can tell, but I'm hoping you're gonna wash those dishes later?" she asked with her mouth full. Jacob smiled brightly and nodded, seeming to have every intention of washing them himself. "Don't worry, I'll take care of them. Sorry, I guess I got a little carried away," he chuckled. Sylvie returned his smile as she focused on her breakfast, having grown accustomed to his near-constant over-eagerness. Jacob played tug-of-war with Scuggy while he waited for Sylvie to finish her breakfast, and when she was done, she got up and put her plate in the sink before going to the door to put her boots on. "Ready to get going?" she asked as she grabbed his bright orange vest and put it on. She'd grown rather attached to the vest, bearing the symbols of his homeland over the last 3 months they'd spent together. Jacob came over quickly and put on his dark red jacket that hung to his knees. "All set when you are," he replied happily as he pulled on his boots. She nodded in reply before scratching Scuggy vigorously on the head, saying, "We'll be back later, Scug boy. Be a good boy for me until we get home, okay?" Scuggy whined slightly in response, sad he'd be left alone all day until they returned in the evening. Sylvie crouched down and scratched both sides of his neck playfully with a smile before saying, "It's okay, baby. I love that Scuggy puppy." He yipped happily in reply before she picked up a ball and tossed it into their living room. Scuggy, of course, dashed over with excitement before Jacob and Sylvie quickly slipped out the front door. Once outside, they were on the main residential street of Asgard, a divine city built atop the clouds with hundreds of buildings, some housing heroes and Sylvie's demigod siblings, though most were the homes of various spirits who lived in Asgard and partied in the halls of Valhalla with the likes of Odin, Thor, and the rest of the Norse pantheon. The buildings were made of the same cloudy surface as the ground in this place, and although they appeared nearly uniform on the outside, every one of them had near limitless possibilities for what they could look like on the inside, each being a realm that could be redesigned by a divine to be whatever they desired. Outside the main city, the entire place was surrounded by cloudy castles belonging to various gods of the Norse pantheon, including one that belonged to Sylvie's mother, Freya. Following their streets led to the main gate, allowing access to the mortal realm, or Midgard as the Asgardian called it. On the opposing side of the city was the trunk of the world tree, Yggdrasil, a massive, gorgeous black tree covered in white speckles that sparkled like starlight. Then luminous branches hung high and numerous over Asgard, stretching well beyond the Norse realm of realms. You could only see part of the trunk rising through the cloudy floor of the divine city, and the top reached so high it was well out of view, though occasionally star-shaped leaves would drift down from on high before landing in the cloudy streets. Jacob and Sylvie headed down to the main gate where they were surprised to be stopped by Heimdall, guardian of the Rainbow Bridge Bifrost that connects Asgard to Midgard. "Hey, Sylvie, Jacob, hold on a moment," Heimdall asked. Seeing them headed toward the bridge to join their mortal master for training in elementalism, the art of manipulating the elements. "Sure, what's up, Heimdall?" Sylvie asked as they stopped to chat with him. "Lord Odin has asked me not to allow anyone in or out of Asgard until he gives the all-clear, so I'm sorry, but I'm afraid I can't let you leave today," he said reluctantly. "What? Again? What is it this time?" Jacob asked with minor irritation. "I'm not sure. Sorry, I know this is inconvenient for your training," he said with disappointment. "It's all right. We know you're just the messenger. Right, Jacob?" Sylvie asked, nudging him to ensure he didn't forget his manners. "Yeah, right," he said, rubbing his elbow where she nudged him. "I guess I'd better tell Asha we won't be coming today." Sylvie nodded and waited patiently a moment as Jacob reached out and had a conversation with their teacher in his mind. The brief exchange seemed to put Jacob in a somewhat dour mood, but he did his best to hide it when he turned to Sylvie. "All right, so I guess we're changing plans for today at least. What do you want to do?" he asked kindly. "Well, since we can't leave, I suppose we could go get some practice in Valhalla," Sylvie mused. Jacob didn't seem to like that idea very much. "Actually, I was hoping we could save Valhalla for when I'm finally ready to challenge Thor again. I'm a little embarrassed after what happened last time," he replied. "What happened last time?" Heimdall asked. Don't ask, Jacob said with a sigh of exasperation. Heimdall seemed somewhat dejected he wouldn't have his curiosity sated. I'm guessing you don't want to train with my mom, Sylvie asked cautiously, quite sure she already knew the answer. Jacob shook his head with an almost fearful look in his eye. All right, well, I guess we could spar up here, just the two of us, Sylvie offered, running short of options. That sounds all right. Do you know any good spots around here? Jacob asked. Well, I could make us a place at home, but I was hoping to get some fresh air. Wait, I know. Come on, follow me, Sylvie said with excitement before grabbing Jacob by the wrist and running back toward their house. Jacob ran with excitement beside her as they headed up the cloudy street to their home, but he was gobsmacked when they ran right past it. He followed along silently as they went, wondering just what incredible place his beloved wanted to show him this time. Jacob and Sylvie kept running, breaking past the city and continuing to dash toward Yggdrasil. He'd never been that close to it up until that point and gasped with surprise when they finally reached it. The pair skidded to a stop at the edge of the field of cloud cover, finding a large gap between the Nimbus barrier and the Tree of Life. Huh? Whoa! Look at that! I didn't know you could see all the way down there, with excitement, he said as he knelt down by the edge and peered over it. Yeah, it's pretty cool, right? Sylvie asked with satisfaction. It's crazy. What's down there? He asked eagerly. I don't really know. I think my mom said something about the gap of creation or something. I don't really remember, if I'm being honest, she said with a chuckle. Really? I know. Why don't we skip training today and go check it out? He asked in reply, squinting and shading his eyes to try and see down to the roots of the great tree. We're not allowed to leave Asgard, remember? She asked coyly in reply. What do you mean? I thought Yggdrasil was part of Asgard, Jacob asked as he got up and looked at her for answers. Well, it is, but it's also a part of the other realms as well. I'm not sure exactly where it is in Midgard, but my mom has mentioned going to see it there once, she recalled. Cool! So that means down there is another realm, right? He confirmed. She nodded. Interesting. Know anything else about it? I think it's called Niflheim, but honestly I don't really know much more than I've already said. I think there's supposed to be 9 realms, but it's been too long since I learned about it. She answered with a nervous laugh. Niflheim, huh? Too bad we can't go and see it, Jacob sighed dramatically, trying to seem nonchalant as he rested his hands behind his neck. You're planning something, aren't you? Sylvie accused. What? Who? Me? No, I would never, he said with the cheekiest of grins, clearly trying to appeal to Sylvie's mischievous side. You'd better not. You might be able to get away with defying your king of gods back home, but Lord Odin will punish us harshly if we disobey him. He doesn't care whether you're a guest or you were born here. He won't take pity on you, she decried. Jacob seemed to realize how serious she was, and his grin drooped significantly, but traces of it still remained on his lips. Oh, come on, I was just kidding. Besides, there's no reason we can't check it out later, he said casually, trying to get her to lighten up. Yeah, I guess we could, Sylvie replied, glad he was letting it go. So, are you ready to get started? Of course, he replied cheerfully as he started away from the edge and took a place in the open cloud field. Sylvie found a spot she liked and took up an aggressive stance. Jacob smirked at her and took a defensive stance, clearly excited for the contest before them. Sylvie waited a few moments as the breeze drifted toward Yggdrasil, wondering if Jacob would make the first move. When he saw she was waiting to see what he would do, he dashed off to her left before curving inward and leaping in for a haymaker bathed in flames. Sylvie ducked underneath him and followed his momentum, spraying ice and where he would land and coating the ground in a slippery layer of frost. Jacob landed fine, but as he skidded across the ice, he slipped and fell flat on his face, sliding backward away from her. Sylvie knew this was her opportunity and skated quickly across the ice before leaping and hurling a frost ball at him as she closed in. Jacob spun to his feet in a whirlwind of fire, as she'd anticipated, melting her ice ball before it could touch him. But he seemed surprised when she flew in and slammed her chest into his, seeming to have slightly misjudged their positioning. Before she could react, Jacob had twisted himself around her, grabbing her arms and legs with his own, leaving him standing on one foot with the two of them locked together. Sylvie struggled to break free, but found he had a tight grip on her, unable to shift her arms enough to overpower him. She strained herself against him, and found herself shocked when he gave her a big smile and a tiny kiss on the nose before leaping up into the air, dragging her into the sky with him. She was taken by surprise again when he released most of her and grabbed her tightly by the arm with both hands. Suddenly he began to spin before throwing her hard at the ground, but Sylvie landed on her feet and smirked up at him. Jacob was surprised, disappointed he'd wasted his opportunity. But then as he fell, Sylvie realized he had jumped them right over the gap between Yggdrasil and the cloudy floor. She started running toward him and reached out, calling his name, but she was surprised when he used a burst of flame from his foot to recover and land just fine at the edge. Jacob! Oh, jeez. Don't scare me like that. I thought you were about to fall, she scolded. Jacob just scratched the back of his neck and chuckled. Come on, you really think I would do something so foolish on accident? He replied. No, I thought you were doing it on purpose, she said in a huff, having thought Jacob was throwing himself into Niflheim so he could explore. Don't be silly. I might be a little thoughtless sometimes, but I'm not that bad, he said with a grin. Now then, what do you say we take this up a notch? He asked with excitement, pulling off his scarf and jacket before folding them up and setting them down behind him. Sylvie was excited to get serious, so she retook her stance, but a little surprised when instead of retaking his, Jacob seemed to tense up, clenching nearly every muscle in his body as his power started climbing. Jacob's deep green eyes started flashing bright golden as his power continued to rise, and wind started rushing away from him in all directions. But Sylvie gasped when Jacob's scarf and coat were blown away in the draft, wafting right over the gap into Niflheim. Huh? Jacob! She shouted as she started running toward it. Jacob was surprised but traced her eyes, shocked to find his beloved scarf drifting over the expanse. Without thinking, he leaped after it, managing to snatch it right out of the air. However, Sylvie was completely aghast as Jacob disappeared from view completely, suddenly vanished into thin air along with his scarf and jacket. She looked around wildly as she wondered what she would do, hoping he would reappear in just a moment or two using fire to ascend past the cloudy barrier. When he didn't reappear after 10 seconds, Sylvie was beside herself, stomping her feet in a frustrated dance of irritation and confusion. Oh, damn him, she said to herself, left with only one choice in mind. With no other options left, she steeled herself, clenched her fists, and jumped over the edge, plugging her nose with her finger and thumb, and holding her breath like she was jumping into a lake. Chapter 2. No Way Home. Sylvie leaped over the edge and was surprised to find the pleasing landscape she'd seen from above suddenly shift as she fell through the gap between Yggdrasil and Asgard, taking it from a green and vibrant spot that had looked to be somewhere in Midgard, and leaving her falling over a snow-field kingdom with a frozen ocean surrounding it on all sides. She was shocked to find Jacob hovering in the air using his flames and looking bewildered with his eyes on the sky, but grateful when he grabbed her by the wrists and hoisted her up to him, holding her tight so she wouldn't fall. She looked at him with fury but saw his attention was taken by the sky, so she followed his gaze and felt her stomach sink into her feet. The very sky itself seemed to end just above them where they'd fallen inside, leaving nothing but a massive sheet of ice between them and Asgard. Hey, I can't believe you, you jerk! I thought you said you weren't going to do something so stupid, Sylvie accosted, pounding on his shoulder with her fist. Sylvie waited for him to respond, but was surprised when he didn't. Jacob? Does something feel kind of funny around here? He asked, sounding a little woozy. Sylvie was beyond shocked and waved a hand, using her elementalism to will the sheet of ice above them into a shape and create a platform they could stand on. But Jacob seemed too out of it to notice. Now that he mentioned it, she started feeling something too. A creeping chill that washed over her, starting from her fingertips. Sylvie needed to calm down, so she made him release her and stepped down onto the sheet of ice. It was only then that she noticed the flames spraying from Jacob's feet weren't their usual red color, but were instead a bright pink. She pulled him by the hand to get him to land on the ice platform she'd made for them, but for some reason Jacob didn't extinguish his flames, seeming overcome as his cheeks went rosy, and he put a hand to his forehead. Jacob, stop, she insisted, grabbing him by the shoulders and making him look her in the eye. Something about it seemed to work, and Jacob stopped producing flames from his feet, landing on the ice and doubling over as he dropped to his knees. Are you all right? What's wrong? She asked desperately, her confusion and panic starting to grow. I don't know. I think I'm all right now. Just give me a minute, he gasped, still quite out of sorts. All right, you catch your breath while I open up that ice wall, and then we're going home. I can't believe this. You always get me into trouble, she said with frustration. Sorry, he wheezed, clutching a hand to his chest. That worried her greatly, but Sylvie didn't have time to think about that right now. She turned to the frozen sheet of ice that seemed to completely surround this part of Yggdrasil and reached out to it, using her ice elementalism to open a hole above them large enough to jump through. But she was surprised when only part of the ice followed her command. The rest remained in place above them, unwilling to open and allow them to leave. What the? She asked herself, but now she could feel it again. As she tried to command the ice to open, it was like she could feel her emotions draining from her until a thought pierced the back of her mind. Who cares? She wondered. She didn't know where that came from and shook the question from her mind, returning her attention to the ice barrier that vexed her so. But as she continued trying to manipulate it, she felt more strange thoughts creep into her mind like frost over grass in the morning. Why am I wasting my time? It won't budge, so what's the point? It's not like I care anyway. Besides, what was I? She trailed off, losing her train of thought as her knees buckled under her. Sylvie felt faint as she began to fall, but she was jolted back to life when Jacob grabbed her by the wrist, saving her from tumbling from their icy platform. He pulled her up and got her to her feet, making sure she was able to stand after having stopped her fall. Are you okay? He asked with concern, holding her close and helping her stay upright. I will be. What's going on? She asked as she tried to reorganize her thoughts. I don't know. There's something strange about this place, though. That's for sure. I don't know what was happening, but I was feeling charmed, I guess. I'm not really sure how to explain it. Is that what it felt like for you? He asked nervously. Sylvie finally managed to shake the cobwebs from her mind. No, it was different. I felt, I don't know. Empty is the only word that comes to mind, she replied, rubbing her temple with her fingers, hoping it would make her headache go away. Luckily, she found it relieved her pain somewhat effectively. That's so weird. Well, whatever it is, it seems to have passed for now. Why don't you sit down a few minutes? I'll open up that hole the rest of the way and we'll get out of here, he said anxiously. All right, Sylvie said, accepting his help to sit down as she tried to catch her breath and clear the fog from her mind. Jacob made sure she was all right before returning his attention to the hole she'd started, but as he reached out for it, something seemed to come over him again. Jacob seemed to be struggling against it, so Sylvie braced herself, expecting another wave of her own affliction to assault her a second time. Jacob seemed completely unable to open the frozen barrier between Niflheim and Asgard, just like she was, and as he struggled, she noticed his knees going wobbly. She got up to catch him in case he had an episode like she did, but was very surprised when he grunted with great frustration and used a hand to start spraying flames upward toward the sealed hole in the frosty ceiling. What surprised her more than that, though, was the color. She had expected him to wash pink flame over the opening as he'd used to hover, but instead this one was a deep red, a much darker, bloodier red than the fire he'd used against her just a few minutes ago. Jacob seemed to get even more frustrated when he noticed it wasn't working, and snorted as he raised his other hand and poured a torrent of flame over the spot. But despite all his effort, he wasn't even melting it. Jacob stomped a foot, and Sylvie grew worried. He could have a bit of an anger issue sometimes, but it was rare for him to get so frustrated so quickly. She nearly leaped back as he opened his mouth and spewed fire breath at it too, trying everything in his power to remove the barrier. Jacob, stop! That's enough. Can't you see it isn't working? She demanded, shaking him by the shoulder. He turned his head toward her with fire still surging from his mouth, nearly spraying it right at her and bringing him back to his senses as he suddenly stopped and seemed to realize what he was doing. Oh man, I'm so sorry, Sylvie. Are you okay? He asked with distress. Yeah, I'm fine. I'm worried about you. Are you sure you're all right? Something about this place is making you act funny. I know we haven't really known each other all that long, but this still isn't like you. What's happening? She asked with dismay. I'm not sure. When it wasn't working, I got really angry, and before I knew it, I was out of control, he confessed, seeming like it embarrassed him greatly. Well, either way, we can't seem to open that ice barrier from this side. We'll have to try something else. Hang on, I'm gonna contact my mom. She'll know what to do, Sylvie replied, falling back on the one person who absolutely never failed her. Mom? Mom? Hello? Mom? I really need your help. Right now, she called with her mind. Despite her desperate plea, her mother failed to respond. Something's not right. She's not answering, she explained. That's weird. Normally gods can hear prayers no matter what realm they're in. I'll try reaching out to Master Nike. Nope, she's not answering either. I guess we're on our own out here, Jacob said, scratching the back of his head with embarrassment. Well, that's just great. Why'd you have to go and get us trapped down here like this? I can't believe you would do something so stupid, Sylvie fumed, feeling lost without someone to rescue them. I said I was sorry, Jacob said, raising his hands defensively. I just really didn't want to lose the scarf you made me. That's all, he bashfully admitted, seeming unsure of where his jacket had fallen. Yeah, well, I could have just made you a new one, she insisted. I guess, but I've gotten attached to this one, he said sheepishly. Sylvie was still pretty irritated, but she sighed with frustration, forcing herself to regain control. Fine. Why don't we go look around and see if there might be any way we can get back home? At least that way we're doing something productive instead of waiting around to be rescued, she said. That sounds like a good idea. Let's keep our guard up. There's definitely still something weird about this place we don't understand yet. Something about it gives me the creeps, he replied. Sylvie nodded. With that, the young couple stepped to the edge of their icy platform and took stock of the landscape below. The kingdom was large, but looked like it would take less than a day to travel from one end to the other on foot. It had a large castle in the center with something that appeared to be an incredibly massive basin that had crashed through one of the castle walls long ago. Otherwise, the only discernible detail about the castle itself was that there was a small wooden cottage and slightly wooded area not far from the entrance. The castle seemed to be resting atop a mountain peak, with deep valleys between it and the tall, four-sided outer walls, a large icy expanse being most of what lay between it and the 4 villages that each rested nestled in the corners of the castle walls, with bits of forest sprinkled here and there. One wall was quite close to the trunk of Yggdrasil, which sank down below the ice, and the trunk had a large gap near the ground where lava and frost met, seemingly coming from the great tree itself. Each village at the 4 corners was small, and 3 out of the 4 had smoke rising from them, indicating the activity of inhabitants. Each village also seemed to have a building far larger than the rest, the ancient dilapidated stone crumbling in places as time weighed heavy on their earthen walls. Jacob raised a hand to his chin, not sure where they should start looking for information. His attention was taken when Sylvie cracked her knuckles and stretched herself out. Well, we might as well start from the castle in the center. No point in asking a small fish when there might be a way to learn something from the sharks themselves, she rationalized. Jacob nodded, seeming to think that was both reasonable and well thought out. Sylvie was a little surprised when Jacob took her hand, holding it tightly and looking to her. Listen, I know I messed up, but I promise I'll get us out of this mess somehow. You have my word on that, he said with determination, seeming a bit shaken by the whole thing. Sylvie smiled at him, glad they had each other if nothing else in this situation. She nodded to him, and he returned his attention to the land below with a gulp. Ready? He asked. She nodded again, and he nodded to himself. All right. 1, 2, 3, he said, and the pair leaped over the edge, falling fast through the frosty air toward the center of the kingdom. The pair spent several seconds dropping through the chilly atmosphere as they quickly approached the ground, until finally they landed hard on their feet, each bending their knees and feeling the force of their landing vibrate up their entire bodies. They took a moment to shake the feeling out before walking together up the pathway leading to the castle. It was much larger in person than it had been from above, and the dark gray bricks seemed ancient, covered with frost, moss, and debris from the broken wall. They found a doorway leading inside and gave pause a moment as they heard the sound of metal hammering metal, a nostalgic but uneasy look on Jacob's face as he continued inside. Sylvie followed him in as they traced the sound through the narrow passageway, pleased when they eventually found a corridor with light coming through the doorway at the end. Jacob led Sylvie deeper, and the pair entered the doorway without invitation, glancing around carefully instead of revealing themselves right away. Inside appeared to be a small workshop with an active forge on the far side, sporting several sets of weapon racks with various tools of war resting on them. Most of the weapons were rusted and broken, and Sylvie looked up to see a large segment of the ceiling missing from the room. Otherwise, there were 4 torches resting in sconces, 2 of which were lit while the others had gone out. Curiously, the 2 flames of the torches were different colors. One was a soft, light purple color, reminding Sylvie of a hydrangea, and the other was a deep, bloody red, the same red that spewed from Jacob's mouth and hands just a few minutes before. Otherwise, the room was largely empty, save a wooden table and some chairs set around it, all except for the man standing at an anvil not far from the forge. He had dark brown skin and long white hair that hung to the center of his back, and a beard of the same color that had gotten gray and black ash and scorch marks near the bottom, hanging just above his stomach. His hair was curly and hung largely over his eyes, though he kept reaching up and using his wrists to reveal a deep red eye so he could see what he was doing. He wore a crown on his head that seemed fairly plain, save the red diamond gemstones sticking out from the top on pointed spikes encircling the outside. The crown had odd symbols Sylvie and Jacob could only describe as trees going around the base, but after my father drew them for me, and with what I know now, I believe they may have been a club from the suit of playing cards. He was adorned with a noble green garb that sported yellow edges and came together in the middle, having symbols of the sun on both sides of the chest and on the hips, as well as a red cape that hung over his shoulders, dangling little hearts from teardrops of cloth around his collarbone and his upper arms. He also wore a simple pair of brown leather gloves and boots, and there was a staff resting near the forge that appeared to be an entire tree sapling, roots and all, that had pink-budded flowers sprouting from the leafy top. The man pounded away at the scorching metal before picking it up with his tongs and examining it closely, stepping away from the anvil and returning it to the forge for more heat. Jacob glanced at Sylvie and she nodded to him. With that, the young couple stepped up behind the aged royal. "Excuse me, we're lost, and we're hoping you could give us some directions," Jacob asked. The man seemed quite surprised as he turned around, pushing his hair out of his eyes momentarily to get a good look at the youngsters. "Lost? What do you mean? I thought no one could enter or leave this place," he replied in a rugged, deep voice, seeming troubled. "We're from Asgard. We accidentally fell through the gap between Yggdrasil and our home, and we're hoping to find a way back quickly," Sylvie replied. "Asgard? I think my father mentioned that place when I was a boy, but still, I'm afraid that won't be possible unless we can manage to light the Fernal Kiln," he replied, disappointed that he was unable to help. "The Fernal Kiln? What's that?" Jacob asked curiously. "You must have seen it when you entered. The large, ancient kiln broken through the castle walls outside. It was broken long before I arrived here, so I'm sorry, but I can't afford to be distracted from my work," he replied, turning his back on them and checking the metal pieces in the forge, pulling one from the fire with his tongs and returning to the anvil to work on it. "Wait, so if we can light that kiln, we can head back to Asgard?" Jacob asked enthusiastically, his enthusiasm shrinking when the old man shrugged in response. He looked to Sylvie with his lips pursed, seeming unsure of how to proceed. "Are you working on fixing it now? So we just have to wait a little while and we should be all set to leave?" she asked, hoping clarifying the facts would help. "I will fix the kiln, but the problem lies not in repair, but in ignition," he replied sternly. "Ignition? Well, no problem. I can light that kiln in a jiffy," Jacob said enthusiastically. "No, you cannot," he replied simply. Before anyone could say anything more, the old man gasped, taking them by surprise. "No! And now another one has gone out. Damn it! What's going on out there?" he asked himself in distress, looking up to the 4 torches on the wall. Jacob and Sylvie followed his eyes to see the 4 torches from before, but the one with the deep red flame had been extinguished. Chapter 3. In the Fires of Emotion. The only torch still lit on the wall was a pale purple one, smoke gently wafting from the red one that had just gone out. Jacob approached the torches, catching the attention of the old-timer. "Hey, it's no big deal. I can light them for you again, no problem. See?" he asked, raising a hand toward one of the unlit torches and creating a small, deep blue flame in the palm of his hand. Jacob seemed quite curious about the color of the flame, but before he could say anything else, the old man grabbed him right by the wrist, getting up in his face and looking him dead in the eyes. "You arrogant fool! Extinguish your flame, quickly, lest you be overcome by the flame of ambition," he demanded, spit flying from his lips and landing on Jacob's face as the young man looked at him with shock. With simply a thought, the flame was extinguished, and the old man released him, leaving Jacob rubbing his wrist as he took a step back before wiping his face. "I'm so confused. What do you mean, the flame of ambition? Who exactly are you, old-timer? What's really going on here?" Jacob asked. The old king seemed reluctant to answer, so Sylvie stepped up beside her young partner. "Please, I promise we only want to help if we can," she assured. The old man sighed and rubbed the bridge of his nose with his fingers a moment before gesturing for them to have a seat at the table, going over and taking a seat for himself. Jacob and Sylvie joined him at the table as he told his story. "My name is King Reinhard Verdal, and this place you found yourself in is the Fernal Kiln, resting place of what was supposedly a great empire many millennia ago. What little I know of it I was told by my father, and although I may be called a king and wear this raucous attire, I'm little more than the helmsman of this doomed endeavor. You see, this land is not my home. My family and I come from a place called Fernal, a great distance to the east from here. I'm told nearly 300 years ago my homeland was frozen over by the frost of apathy. Unfortunately, I've never seen it with my own eyes, and I don't think I ever will. I was born to my mother whilst she and my father traveled here, the last survivors of a group who ventured across the ocean of ice to find this place. It's my duty to fix the kiln and light the 4 flames around the corners of the kingdom, and once I've done so, I'll finally be able to light the Fernal Kiln and end the never-ending winter caused by the frost of apathy. When we arrived here, 2 of the 4 torches were lit, but it seems now only 1 remains. My wife, daughter, and one of my sons have gone out to attempt to relight the other kilns, and while the Kiln of Fear seems to have been lit, in its place the Kiln of Ambition has smoldered out. Worse yet, as you may have just seen, the Kiln of Rage has gone out now too, he explained, seeming dejected. Fear, ambition, rage... What's the 4th one? Sylvie asked quickly, using her fingers to keep track. The remaining kiln would be that of the Flame of Love, he explained. Love, ambition, rage, and fear? Don't those seem kind of contradictory? I mean, all this is making my head spin, Jacob said, wincing like he was getting a headache. Sylvie took his hand, and he seemed to appreciate her showing him that she was there for him. I have little time to wonder about such things. You 2 said you're willing to help, correct? Verdal asked cautiously. My mother and father exchanged a glance with each other before looking to him with determination in their eyes, giving him a nod together. Thank the gods. We can use all the help we can get. As I explained, my wife, daughter, and son went out to light the 4 kilns, but haven't returned. With the torches here going out one after another, I fear something may have gone wrong. Could you please check on them for me? And if you can, could you help them light the 4 kilns? I would be eternally grateful for any aid you could lend them. If we manage to light them all, what exactly will that do? Sylvie asked quickly. The Fernal Kiln may only be lit when all 4 flames of emotion are used to light it simultaneously. According to my father, doing so will ignite a new flame, ending the eternal winter of the frost of apathy, and bringing thawing spring to the land, he explained. That doesn't sound so bad, Sylvie said to herself. Tell me more about this frost of apathy. I wish I could, but I know nothing of it myself. As I said, my family and I only just arrived here recently, he explained. Okay, but that doesn't explain what you said earlier about being overcome by the flame of ambition, Jacob retorted, noting the man's discomfort at bringing it up. Yes, well, I know little of it, but what I can tell you is that this land seems to be completely overcast with these elements of emotion. Any who uses elementalism to control flame or frost alike will find themselves overcome by the feeling of whatever element they've created or manipulated. Like you, my family can also use elementalism, and we've only discovered all this recently. If you create frost, you'll become apathetic and sluggish. Using flames will cause one of the 4 emotional fires to attempt to overwhelm you. Unfortunately, that's all I know, he presented. I see. So it's dangerous to use elementalism here. That's not good, Jacob responded. It would seem that using the other elements doesn't have the same effect, but I've only been able to test the element of life so far. Still, using them could prove dangerous, since I don't know what effect they may have on the user. That aside, I'm unable to control the element of metal and several others, meaning I must attempt to repair the Fernal Kiln by hand, Verdal explained. Jacob stroked his chin as he nodded in thought. How long have your wife and children been gone? Sylvie asked quickly. Somewhere in the range of 4 days, he explained, looking dejected. And you haven't gone to check on them? Jacob asked in exasperation. The old king pursed his lips, seeming agitated by his accusatory tone. I must repair the Fernal Kiln before the flames are lit, and I have faith that my family will still succeed. That aside, I did ask my eldest son to go out and look for them, but the useless lump whined about being too frightened to leave the kiln, Verdal said, sounding embarrassed. Wait, so then where is he? Jacob asked quickly as he looked around again. He's outside in the lodge I created when we arrived, he explained. I've been unable to leave the forge to talk with him, and he doesn't enjoy spending time inside here. Perhaps you 2 could rouse him to our cause. We'll give it our best shot, Jacob said with guts and determination, raising a fist. Yeah, but for now, is there anything else you can tell us about this mission, or maybe this place? Anything at all could be useful, Sylvie said, making Jacob nod in agreement. King Verdal put a hand to his chin, pondering about something as he stroked his dirty white beard. You know, there is something that's been bothering me. My father told me this was once the land of the fire giants, where some great ancient war was held. Yet, I haven't seen hide nor hair of the fire giants anywhere, nor whatever enemy they found themselves engaged with. I'm not sure what it all means, but perhaps by looking at the memorials, or maybe what remains of their kingdom, you could learn more. I can't tell you how pitiable it feels, struggling towards a goal that only seems to be getting further away, he replied. Well, don't worry. We'll find your wife and kids and get those torches lit, Jacob said with enthusiasm as he stood up. His bright spirit seemed to lighten Verdal's mood, if only slightly. Don't forget, we're supposed to be looking for a way back home, Sylvie said coldly, making Jacob stop in his tracks. Oh yeah, that reminds me. Why did you say you didn't think anyone could enter or leave this place, Jacob asked, surprising Sylvie that she'd forgotten that detail. This land is surrounded by a vast ocean of ice. As I explained, it took my family nearly 300 years to reach this place on foot over generations. I left our map in the lodge I created. It only shows a few places on it, but all of them are further away than Farinal according to the map, he explained. I see. So you didn't mean literally. You meant the distance was too great with the knowledge you have, Jacob caught on, tapping his cheek. Verdal nodded strongly in response. I just have one more question. Why exactly can't you just use elementalism a little bit and light each of the torches with the flames you can create? I mean, sure, you have a small chance of succumbing, but is it really that dangerous? Jacob asked, taking Sylvie by surprise at how well thought out his question was. The torches in this room seem to be enchanted and will only be lit or extinguished in response to the kiln of its designation. Your suggestion is an intelligent one, but we've already given it a try to find that that shortcut didn't work. It might be possible to light the kilns themselves this way, but without further experimentation, I'm afraid I don't have the answer, Verdal replied, satisfying Jacob's curiosity. All right then, well I guess we don't have any choice but to try and find these kilns and light them, Jacob said. Sylvie nodded in response as she got to her feet. Jacob smiled at her, but Verdal remained seated. After a moment, he chuckled to himself. Thank you so much. Our situation looked bleak at best, but you two seem sharp. Thank you for giving me a little hope to hold on to, he said bitterly. Sylvie saw in Jacob's eyes how intensely he wanted to help the old king, a trait she deeply admired. Still, she wasn't going to be left behind, so Sylvie steeled herself and clenched a fist, holding it up to King Verdal. We'll be back as quick as we can. I don't want you to have to worry about your wife and kids any longer than you have to, she said with determination. Jacob nodded strongly as Verdal smiled at them, touched by their sentiment and kindness. Thank you again. I have no reward to offer you, but at the very least my eldest son can offer you some of our rations, he started to say. There's no need for that. We just ate breakfast. Jacob chuckled. Got anything else we need to know before we head out? Verdal thought a moment before shaking his head. All right then. You ready? He asked, turning to Sylvie. She nodded strongly in response. Great. We'll be headed out then. See you later, Reinhard. Take care of yourself while we're gone. Without waiting for the old king to give a parting, Jacob turned and practically ran out the door, making Sylvie jump with surprise before running after him. She turned back and waved at Verdal, calling, "See you soon!" as she chased after her young partner. Jacob and Sylvie ran back through the narrow hallways of the resting place of the Fernal Kiln, making it outside much faster than they made their way in. Just outside, they heard a sigh. Following the sound, they found the young son Verdal had spoken of. A young boy of no more than 7, with short, messy white hair and the same deep red eyes as his father. He sat on a chair near a small table on the porch of the wooden cabin, and he was wearing an eloquent green garb that featured symbols of the sun patterned across the entire thing, and pale yellow fur at the fringes, as well as an unbuttoned black cloak and brown leather gloves and boots. "Who are you?" he asked as the pair ran around the side of the castle toward the small wooden cottage. Jacob stepped up to introduce himself first, as he often did. "I'm Jacob Godley, and this is Sylvie Freya's daughter. We ended up here by accident, but we're hoping we can help your family light the kilns and bring spring to the land," he explained quickly, taking the young boy by surprise. "I was hoping we could take a look at the map your family used to get here." "It won't work," the kid said, looking dejected. "What do you mean?" Sylvie asked in surprise. "I mean it won't work. No matter what you try, we're all gonna die out here," he replied. Jacob and Sylvie were greatly taken aback by the boy's assertion. Not only had he already completely given up, but from the sound of things, he'd already resigned himself to sit and simply wait for death. The pair were shocked to say the least, unsure how someone so young seemed to have no hope at all. "Why do you say that?" Sylvie asked cautiously. "Because the frost of apathy has already won. The war was over centuries before we even got here," he said dejectedly. "But we can still light the kilns and end winter. Won't that—" Jacob started to reply, surprised when the boy cut him off mid-sentence. "And what will we do next winter?" he asked. "Light them again?" Jacob answered, very unsure of his response. "I don't know about you, but I can't stand the thought of having to go through this every year. I refuse to be a slave to my destiny like my father," he responded, clenching his fists and hitting his knees. Sylvie looked at Jacob, expecting him to be looking back at her, but instead he was staring intensely at the boy, a deeply conflicted look of nostalgia and agony on his face. Sylvie thought Jacob was still going over his thoughts and decided to step in, saying, "Don't be ridiculous," but before she could finish her thought, Jacob put a hand on her shoulder. She glanced at him and saw a serious look in his green eyes, telling her to stop. She was surprised, but stopped nonetheless, trusting his instincts. "If that's how you feel, I won't stand in your way, but only if you agree not to stand in mine," he said sternly, surprising them both. Jacob didn't wait for the boy to respond. "Is the map inside here somewhere?" He only nodded in response, the two of them staring deeply into each other's eyes. "All right then. Your father gave us permission to look at it, so you'll forgive us for letting ourselves inside." Without another word, Jacob turned and went inside, Sylvie following closely behind. "Are you sure that wasn't a little harsh?" she asked as the pair stepped inside the largely unfurnished cabin. "No," was all Jacob had to say. Sylvie didn't have time to interpret his statement, as the map was left out in the open for anyone to look at, sprawled out on the table. It was a simple aged map and told them little that they didn't already know. It mentioned a few cities farther away than Fairnall, but the map was ripped and faded in many places and they couldn't make out the names of any of them. "Well, that was a waste of time, but not a big one. I guess we should just head out now, right?" he asked after they finished looking it over. "Yeah, we might as well. I was hoping the map would tell us which kilns were where so we wouldn't accidentally go to the one that was already lit. But this map only calls this place Surtsey," Sylvie replied. Jacob nodded strongly, and the pair headed out. They walked right past the boy without a word, but Sylvie was greatly surprised when Jacob gave pause a few steps down the road. With a sigh, he turned back towards the boy and called out to him. "Hey, we're gonna go out and try to light the kilns and look for the rest of your family. Do you want to come with us?" The boy seemed greatly surprised, but eventually shook his head no. Jacob nodded to him before turning back to the road and starting down it again. Sylvie joined him, surprised he'd asked the boy to tag along. "Do you think he'll be okay?" she asked. "If the rest of his family is, then I have hope he will be. If I'm honest, I didn't really want him to come along with us. It just felt like the right thing to do to at least ask him," he replied. Sylvie pursed her lips and crossed her arms, not sure how she felt about that. Not long after that, they reached a fork in the road, each seemingly leading toward another corner where they would find one of the kilns. The path to their left had smoke rising from the village a ways from there, but the path to their right did not. Without even discussing it, the pair came to a consensus and headed left toward the village where they were sure to find someone alive, if nothing else. Sylvie had expected them to walk straight to the village, but she was surprised when Jacob veered off the road, pointing toward what appeared to be some kind of war memorial. It was a large open space filled to the brim with swords, spears, great swords, axes, battle axes, hammers, lances, and many more weapons jammed into the ground, left standing upright, despite the years of snowfall having rusted all of them. On the handle of one of the longest great swords jammed into the ground, Sylvie saw what Jacob was pointing at. "Hey, look! My jacket!" he said excitedly, running up and pulling his coat right off the hilt before undoing his scarf, pulling the jacket on and wrapping the scarf around his neck once more. "You know, I did forget my sword back home, and who knows what kind of opposition we might face here. Maybe I could borrow one of these for a while," he said, reaching for the same hilt his jacket had landed on. As soon as his hand wrapped around it, Jacob seemed overcome, dropping to one knee and clutching a hand to the side of his head. But despite the discomfort he seemed to be in, he didn't let go of the blade's handle. "Jacob! No! What's wrong? Damn it! Why does this place have to keep screwing with us at every turn?" Sylvie asked herself in exasperation. "It's all right. It's showing me," he explained, his mind seemingly still in a faraway place. "Showing you? Showing you what? She asked in reply. Jacob still wasn't answering, so against her better judgment, Sylvie wrapped her hand around the handle too. Sylvie was shocked to be taken back in time, being shown a hazy memory of the distant past from the perspective of the wielder of the blade. The blade wielder stood on a lava-coated battlefield that seemed like it must have been quite far away from this place. But before Sylvie got her bearings, an army of people with hair that literally burned like fire of various colors charged recklessly forward, the warrior wielding the blade charging right along with them. It was only a moment before they saw their opposition charging at them from the other side of the battlefield. Frost giants and fire giants charged at one another until their forces collided in a furious cacophony of chaotic conflict. The noise, light, and fury of the raging battle roared on in flashes that seemed to be what little the wielder could remember amid the nightmare's skirmish. The wielder struck down dozens of frost giants, and at the end of the outrage, only a handful of fire giants were left standing. Sylvie had thought they would cheer for their victory, but instead the wielder simply looked around, taking in the carnage of the violence. Corpses of both sides lined the battlefield, many of which were impaled to the ground by the extreme number of weapons lining the environment, most of which were in the same place then as they had been in the modern day. Instead of celebrating their victory, the fire giant wielding the large blade planted their weapon into the ground too before turning around and leaning up against it. It was only as the eyes of the wielder looked down to their chest that Sylvie was able to see that they'd suffered a fatal blow, a brutal slash through their chest that was bleeding badly. The fire giant's hands reached down and touched their wound, bringing both hands up and looking at them, covered with their own blood. Finally, the vision released her and Sylvie snapped back to reality. She gasped from the shock of reality returning to her, looking at her hands and hyperventilating, glad to find them not covered in blood. "Geez, that was pretty rough," Jacob said, seeming greatly affected by the vision too. He waited for Sylvie to respond, but she was busy catching her breath. "Well, I guess at least now we know what happened to the fire giants. But still, they didn't seem all that giant to me," he remarked, looking back to the sword. He reached out and touched it, seeming as though the vision didn't take hold of him a second time as he wrapped his hand around the handle. Without much effort, he wrenched it from the ground before Sylvie could protest. "Jacob, we can't just take that. It's an important piece of history," Sylvie decried. "Yeah, but it's not like he's using it anymore. Their war is long over. Still, it's weird that they were fighting on a lava-coated battleground that seemed to be this exact spot. But this whole place is frozen over, right?" he asked in reply. The blade of the sword was nearly as long as he was tall, but Jacob flourished it with as little effort as a knife. "Besides, I noticed something useful about this blade that might help us." "What's that?" she asked, eyeing him as he smirked at her. With a quick bit of focus, Jacob ignited the blade in burning green fire. "Jacob, did you forget we can't use elemental here safely already?" "No, this isn't elementalism. This blade was connected with its wielder and was able to produce the same flame as them. This is just the same reproduction of that flame," he said as he flourished it again before taking a few practice swings. "That still doesn't make it right. What if someone comes here to pay their respects?" Sylvie insisted, unhappy with Jacob's decision. "I'll put it back when we're done," he promised. But Sylvie wasn't having it. "I'm telling you no, Jacob. This is a bad idea," she scolded. "I guess we'll have to agree to disagree then. I feel like this blade was speaking to me and wants me to use it. So sorry, but I'm taking it with me," he said defiantly. Sylvie growled as she clenched her fists, but Jacob was unflinching from her anger. After a moment, she accepted it, stomping her foot as she shouted, "Fine!" before turning and marching furiously back toward the road. Chapter 4. Fear of the Dead. Jacob and Sylvie walked together in silence an hour or so before coming up on the village they'd been looking for. It was a tiny village made only of crumbling buildings and decaying masonry, with a small forest obscuring its view from the castle. There were 2 columns of smoke rising from the far side of the village near the wall where they could barely see the entrance to what appeared to be a temple protruding from the wall itself. Jacob adjusted the large blade he carried over his shoulder as he started to run toward the town, excited to have something to talk about with his beloved. "Hey, look! This place looks ancient," he said, sounding ecstatic to explore somewhere so old. "Ancient is one word for it," Sylvie said as her eyes traced the crumbling ruins. "Oh, come on. Are you still mad?" Jacob asked sheepishly. "A little," she admitted. Jacob sighed to himself and looked down to the ground. "All right, sorry," he said, looking at the blade a moment and thinking of returning it to its resting place, but then deciding against it, not wanting to make their argument or Sylvie's mood worsen. He looked back over the township before turning back to her again. "Hey, I know. Why don't we—" he started to say before stopping short. Sylvie froze when she heard odd-sounding footsteps approaching, the pair carefully scanning their environment for whatever might be the cause. After a moment, Jacob's eyes were locked on one of the crumbled buildings, so Sylvie traced them to find a strange creature unlike anything either of them have ever seen, having just come around the corner. It was a bit taller than Jacob and seemed to be made almost entirely of water. Its form was largely humanoid, with a shifting silhouette that squashed and stretched formlessly with every step, almost like the creature was made of ever-shifting gelatin. It had no eyes, but it did have spots on its face that were indented somewhat like eyes and a mouth, creepily appearing nearly human, but incredibly distant from a real person's facial profile. Inside its chest, they were able to see what they assumed to be its heart, a small, stone-looking thing about the size of a peach, with what appeared to be a face carved into it. And they could also see the creature draw breath, oxygen bubbles being pulled into its chest from the back with every inhale before rising to the top of its head and popping out the top as it exhaled. Needless to say, the pair were on guard, but the creature seemed to pay them no mind, walking aimlessly in the direction it had chosen in front of the crumbled buildings. When it got a little too close, Jacob held the blade out to it and commanded for it to stop, but the creature disobeyed, paying no attention. They could barely hear it whispering something to itself, saying something like, got to, again and again as it passed them by, seemingly entirely unaware of them. Jacob glanced at Sylvie and saw the same mortified look on her face that he himself was wearing before returning the massive blade to his shoulder. That thing's pretty weird, he said to himself. No kidding. Come on, let's follow it, Sylvie said, surprising him. Without hesitation, Jacob nodded and followed her lead. The pair walked slowly behind the creature so they didn't accidentally get too close and disturb it, and after a bit it turned another corner and headed toward a small encampment, where there were around a dozen or so more of them gathered around a pair of light purple campfires. The pair froze when the creature they were following stopped, its head turning toward a fallen tree to their right. It slowly approached the rotted tree, its liquid footsteps squelching through the snow unrhythmically. When it got close enough, it stood there for a few moments, its head turning to look up one side before peering down the other. It seemed to spot something of interest, and moved closer before reaching out its liquidy limbs and grabbing onto a broken segment of the trunk and leaning back, seeming like it was pulling on it. Despite its best efforts, the broken tree refused to give way, seeming as though it was entirely unmoved by the pressure of the creature's wrenching movements. After a few moments, Jacob took pity on the poor creature and walked up to it, giving it a gentle wave. "Hello," he said pleasantly. The being didn't even look at him, seeming entirely unaware that there was anyone there. "Would you like some help?" he asked before waiting several moments. The being hadn't stopped whispering to itself, but Jacob pursed his lips. "How about I lend you a hand?" he offered, reaching down and grabbing the broken segment of the trunk before snapping it off like a twig. He held it in his open hand, offering it to the creature. The being stared at it in his palm before his face actually turned up to look at him, but without any words other than what it was already whispering, it took the broken piece of wood from him and proceeded to start walking away with it, heading in the direction of the camp. Jacob and Sylvie exchanged a glance nervously as they traced the pitiable being's path. "Oh, I get it," Jacob said after a moment. Without warning, he picked up the entire fallen tree and hoisted it over his shoulder. Sylvie figured out what he was doing, and the pair wordlessly followed the creature back to its camp, hauling the broken tree along with them. "Purple. What flame do you think that is, Sylvie?" Jacob asked. "Well, we know ambition is blue and rage is red, so that means it can only be either love or fear, right?" she asked, having used the process of elimination. Jacob nodded. The couple followed the being as it walked up to the camp and dropped its now damp wood into one of the fires before sitting down beside another water creature and holding out its watery arms to the fire, seeming like it was trying to warm them up. Jacob set the broken tree down a good few paces away from the pair of groups and circled around their fires before using the massive blade he'd picked up to chop it into firewood in a matter of moments. Sylvie smiled to herself, appreciating the thought he'd put into helping these creatures. Once he was done, the pair walked around the campsite, asking several questions of the creatures but getting not even a single response. Most of the water beings didn't even look at them, and only a few were mumbling things to themselves. One was saying, "They're coming, but when questioned about whom was coming, of course it failed to respond. Another was saying, my baby, and it gave Sylvie the creeps, so she tried to tune out the rest of their whisperings. "Hey, look at this," Jacob called from the far side of the campsite. Sylvie went right over to find him looking over a small pile of 8 or 9 of what appeared to be those creatures' stone hearts, completely frozen over and left in a small pile away from the groups of the fires. "What are these things?" Jacob asked himself as he picked one up. But he froze when he heard one of the water creatures groan behind him. Suddenly, every single one of the water beings was staring right at him, their unfocused gazes locked directly on the hand he'd used to pick up the frozen heart. Jacob seemed to think better of what he was doing and gently set the heart back on the ground with the others, feeling relieved when the beings all returned their gazes to the small purple fires dancing on what little wood they'd gathered. "It seems like they care about them, whatever they are," Jacob conjectured. "I think they used to be their friends," Sylvie replied sadly, making the color drain from Jacob's face. "These poor creatures. What happened to them?" he asked, answered only by the crackling of quiet flames and the chilling rush of icy wind in the distance. Sylvie didn't answer either, her mind racing as she struggled to grasp what was happening here. "Maybe there's something we can do to help," Jacob asked optimistically. "Like what?" Sylvie asked, hoping he had something more than the straws he was grasping at. "I don't know. I was hoping you might have an idea," he replied. She shook her head and the two exchanged a sorrowful stare for a few moments, looking deep into each other's eyes. After a minute or two, Jacob stepped up and pulled Sylvie close, the pair sharing a warming hug as they looked over the creatures, his mind still poring over every detail as he tried to think of something, anything at all that might help these poor lost souls. Eventually, he got an idea. Releasing Sylvie and returning to the frozen hearts, Jacob turned and faced the water creatures before reaching down and picking up one of the small icy stones. All the beings looked at him again as he did so, but none among them seemed to be making a move. Jacob steeled himself with a gulp before walking over to the fire and holding out the frozen heart close to it, hoping to melt it and possibly return the creature to its former self. The beings all stared at it, motionless as the purple flame caused the ice to start melting and dripping into the fire. Sylvie had expected the screech of steam erupting or maybe for something more to happen, but all that came of it was the ice melting into the fire, leaving the stone barren and warm. Jacob even stuck the heart in his hand directly into the flames, since he was uniquely nearly immune to fire damage, but she was surprised when he pulled his hand back out just as quickly, shaking it and complaining it was too hot before sticking his hand in the snow to cool it off. The beings kept staring at him until he brought the heart back to where the others rested, then returned their gaze to the fires, entirely unbothered by Jacob's experimental attempt to assist them. "So, what should we do now?" he asked, looking to Sylvie with hurt in his eyes. "Well, we know the Kiln of Fear is already lit, but I think it might still do us some good to investigate it anyway. Maybe it could teach us something more about what's going on here and how the kilns function before we reach the others," she offered. Jacob nodded in agreement. With that, the young couple headed toward the temple-like building jutting out from the massive castle wall. They walked up the stairs and through the pathway lined with stone columns before taking in the kiln's resting place from the inside. The columns each had reliefs on them depicting what appeared to be a story. The first image was that of a pair of flame-headed people standing before a pair of mirrors in front of an unlit kiln. The next was largely the same image, but this time the kiln was lit. The third depicted 2 people standing between 4 lit kilns. The last showed only 2 flame-headed folk, but the sky itself appeared to be aflame. Each temple bore the same reliefs on their columns outside. Jacob and Sylvie paid little mind to them, unable to determine their meaning, so the pair didn't linger on them, heading inside quickly. It was a huge square stone room with a large basin-like kiln resting at the back of it, a roaring purple flame dancing in the center. There was also a pair of what appeared to be large glass mirrors standing at either side of it, along with a large metal chest set directly in front of the kiln itself. Jacob walked up and started examining the chest, noting it seemed to be locked and wouldn't budge at his attempt to wrench it open. He turned his attention to one of the mirrors but froze when Sylvie caught his ear. Jacob, look," she said with horror, covering her mouth and pointing toward the kiln. He'd been so busy examining everything else that he hadn't noticed something peculiar about the Kiln of Fear. It was true that it was already lit, but he hadn't noticed that there was a charred foot sticking out from it, burning with the purple flame. Jacob was shocked and jumped up on the chest so he could reach it before carefully peering into the kiln. He grimaced and gulped, but he looked back to make sure Sylvie wasn't in the way before grabbing the body right by the ankle and pulling it free of the kiln. laying its burning flesh down at the foot of the chest before rushing outside. Sylvie was surprised but relieved when he returned a moment later carrying a pile of packed snow, using it to extinguish the flames before pulling the body out from under it so they could examine it. The body seemed to belong to a young woman, likely having died several hours ago at least, from the fact that her eyes, teeth, and other features had been fully liquefied and were missing from the scorched corpse. The body was blackened and charred all over, and otherwise hard to identify, having no notable markings, clothing, jewelry, or other discernible features they could use to say for sure whom the body had once belonged to. Sylvie's stomach churned uncomfortably, and she found herself struggling to look directly at the body, allowing Jacob the time he needed to examine it in greater detail. "Well, I can't say for sure, but I'd say this is either Reinhardt's wife or his daughter," he told her, having taken notice that she was uncomfortable looking at the poor burned woman. "There don't seem to be any traces of chemicals like oil or other combustible materials on her skin, though I suppose by now it likely would have burned away in the inferno," he remarked. After a moment he seemed to get an idea and returned to the kiln, climbing onto the chest and peering over the edge of the bowl as he looked inside. "It doesn't look like there are any other clues in here either," he said with frustration. "Still, I wonder what happened to her. How could she have ended up burning inside the kiln itself?" he asked the room. "What do you mean?" "I don't see any signs of a struggle anywhere," Sylvie said, noting the room was rather barren but notably unbothered. Jacob crossed his arms and thought deeply, his eyes poring over every detail again with great scrutiny. "Well, the way I see it, there are only two options. Either one, she was somehow assassinated, either pushed into the kiln and unable to get out, or killed elsewhere by some untraceable means like poison and brought here to be used as kindling. Or maybe, I wonder if it's possible that she did what I suggested before, and tried using elementalism to light the kiln manually, but she tried to light it and was overcome by the flame before she fell inside and burned to death, becoming the source of the kiln's ignition," he pondered. "That's horrible. Do you think something like that could actually happen?" Sylvie asked in disbelief. Jacob shook his head. "I'm not sure. At this point, we can't rule anything out." Chapter 5. Road to Ambition. Jacob and Sylvie spent a few more minutes poking around the temple looking for anything that might be helpful like other entrances, but all they found was a small empty barracks that seemed long out of service. Sylvie was growing uncomfortable with the corpse on the floor, so Jacob hurried up and the pair left quickly before looking around the small village one more time and finding nothing of interest. After trying and failing to communicate with the water beings one more time, the pair decided it would be best to be on their way so they didn't waste valuable time on fruitless endeavors. It was a long walk from the small village to their next destination, and the pair found themselves walking in near silence as they traveled through the snow near the wall. The only sound breaking the quiet air was the crunching of snow underfoot. The pair were finally getting close enough to actually see the next village, pillars of smoke rising from within the most heavily wooded area they'd seen so far when Jacob asked, "So, what do you want for dinner when we get home?" "If we get home," Sylvie replied bitterly. "Oh, come on. I'm sure we'll find a way if we can manage to," he started to say. "Just stop, Jacob. I know you're trying to be positive, but even if we manage to light these kilns and help these people, there's no guarantee it will open a way back home for us. For all we know, we'll be trapped here forever," she said with anger that surprised even herself. "Well, I guess it's possible, but do you really think that's likely? I mean, surely Odin, Freya, or Athena will start wondering where we are eventually when we don't respond," Jacob conjectured. "You say that like they aren't already looking for us now. The problem is they have no way of knowing we're stuck down here," she replied, crossing her arms. Jacob put his free hand on his hip. "I disagree," he said, making her glare at him. Jacob hesitated for a moment before continuing his thought. "Athena knows everyone and everything that enters or leaves Mount Olympus. I see no reason to believe Odin wouldn't have the same power. Besides that, your mom has kept a pretty tight leash on us. I'd be willing to bet she's watching over us, even now," he explained, looking up to the sky. "Even if she is, what makes you think she can get us home? Why wouldn't she have done it already if she could just do it any time? She would clearly see I really don't like this and would want to help me head home, don't you think?" she asked in reply. "Maybe she's testing you," he offered with a shrug. Sylvie bit her lip in frustration. Jacob could see from the look on her face that she was displeased and added, "You said she's tested you in odd ways before, putting you in uncomfortable situations to see what you would do. I don't see how this is any different." "Please don't talk about her like that," Sylvie said with a sigh of frustration. "I know she isn't nice to you when I'm not looking, but I'm telling you she's a much better person than you think. You just have to give her a chance and she'll show you. Okay, sorry. I wasn't trying to insult her. He started. I know. Let's just hurry up. All right, he carefully agreed. The pair picked up the pace and marched through the wooded area, quickly finding themselves shocked when they stumbled upon what could have been called a massive city, but only if they were both the size of dolls. Whoa! Check this place out, Jacob said with wonder. Sylvie was just as blown away as he was to see the tiny city. It had hundreds of buildings with streetlights, roads, and towers nearly as tall as they were, and they were surprised to see dozens of glowing fairies floating quickly from building to building. Plenty going about their business while others stopped and chatted leisurely with one another. The buildings were made of a blue coral-like substance that was carved into a rounded shape and featured several prominent windows going up the multi-story buildings. The roads were paved in seashells and shiny rocks polished so brightly they glistened and reflected the blue torchlight on the streets. The fairies themselves were just as interesting. Tiny humanoids with wings, clothes, and hair all stylishly worn to accentuate their own personalities, just like little floating people. They fluttered about on their wings, only touching down to the ground to enter buildings or sit and chat with friends, and they all seemed like little busybodies, excitedly going from one place to the next. What are these things? Sylvie asked with awe. They look like fairies. I've heard stories about them, but I've never seen them up close, Jacob said with excitement as his eyes pored over the city, wanting to take in every detail. Fairies? What are those? Sylvie asked with surprise. But before Jacob could answer, the two were surprised to hear an unknown fairy call out, Giants! And before they knew it, the fairies were rushing around in a panic, desperate to get indoors. Giants? Where? Jacob asked, looking around behind them. They mean us, you goof, she said with a smile. Oh, I get it. So that's why the Fire and Frost people were called Fire and Frost Giants. Because to people like the fairies here, they were huge, he said, putting a hand to his chin. Nice one, detective, Sylvie said with a chuckle. Hey, that's ace detective to you, miss, he replied with a smirk. Sylvie couldn't help but giggle a little harder, but they were both surprised when a fairy fluttered up to them wielding a sword and shield. Hey you! State your business, the fairy called in a high-pitched squeak. She had short blonde hair and wore a bright blue dress with red fringes on the shoulders, neck, and hem. She glowed a soft pink and hovered strong with her shield at the ready and her sword pointed at Jacob, a determined look in her bright blue eyes. We're here to light the nearby kiln. Don't worry, we don't mean any harm, Jacob said as the fairy floated a little closer. Then what's with the giant sword? And that axe on your hip? You two look pretty well armed to be here just to light a fire, she said defiantly. They're just to defend ourselves, nothing more, Jacob said, pulling the blade off his shoulder and planting it in the ground. See? We don't want to hurt anybody. Right, Sylvie? He asked. She nodded, but the fairy's eyes hung on Sylvie's axe. Follow his example, and I'll let you pass, the fairy said, pointing her blade at Sylvie's hip. I'm sorry. This axe was a gift from my mother. I can't just leave it lying around, she said. Well, then you're not allowed in our city, the fairy cried out, fluttering backward just a bit before taking up a defensive stance. Is the kiln in the city limits? We don't mind going around, Jacob offered. No, it's to the temple off to the north, the fairy explained. Good, just like the last one. All right, we'll be on our way then. Sorry for scaring you all, Jacob apologized politely before picking up his sword and heaving it back over his shoulder. Sylvie nodded in agreement and followed him as he started heading toward the temple. Hold! No one's allowed in the temple without permission from the elders, the fairy called. Listen, I understand you guys have your traditions, but we really don't have time for this. There are people's lives on the line, and that might include the fate of your entire culture, Jacob explained. The fairy seemed taken aback and put a hand to her chin. Really? Then I suppose making you wait for those old geezers to come to an agreement might pose more of a problem than it's worth, she replied. We don't want to cause any issues, but we can't really afford to wait around, Sylvie added. The fairy seemed conflicted, but it only took her a moment or two to decide. All right, then. I'll escort you, she said. Jacob and Sylvie shared a concerned but somewhat pleased glance with each other, glad they'd gotten through to the little one. Well, since we're going to be traveling together, what's your name? Jacob asked. I'm Tattle. What should I call you two? She asked. I'm Sylvie Freya's daughter, and this is my idiot boyfriend, Jacob Godley, she introduced with a smirk. Jacob looked a little annoyed to be described in that way, but seemed to recognize it was a joke and let it go. With that, Jacob, Sylvie, and Tattle started heading toward the temple, talking amongst themselves as they went. So, your city is pretty impressive. Did you build it all by yourselves? Jacob asked. Yep, That's classic Fey engineering at its finest, Tattle said proudly. Feytel has stood strong for nearly 10,000 years, and our oldest elder was actually one of the 3 nomads who founded it. Wow, that's really something, Sylvie said, having been thoroughly impressed. So, what do you all do in your daily lives? Well, it depends on which fairy you're asking. I spend a lot of my days training to get stronger so I can protect the city from anyone who wants to hurt us. Sometimes animals from the forest come hunting for an easy meal, like that damned fox from a couple months ago. But most of us have big dreams of making fairy society a better place for everyone, she explained. Really? Like how? Jacob asked. Lots of different ways, but inventions are becoming more and more popular lately. We just installed a siren system that will play a loud alarm over the entire city whenever we're in danger. It's pretty new technology, but it should help everyone get indoors faster if a real threat ever shows up. Wow, that's amazing, Jacob said, awestruck by the idea. Hey look, we're nearly there, Sylvie said with excitement, Jacob's eagerness rubbing off on her. She pointed through the trees, and only a moment later they broke through the tree line, finding themselves at the foot of the stone temple. All right, let's light that flame, Jacob said before running up the steps. Sylvie ran after him, and the pair, escorted by Tattle, made their way inside. Much like the last temple, the place was largely barren, save the kiln, a pair of mirrors, and a locked metal chest. More mirrors. What do you think we do with them? He asked, heading up to one and looking deep into his own reflection. I'm not sure. Surely there's got to be some kind of trick to them, right? She asked. If you want to light the kiln, you'll have to pass the trial. All you have to do is each look into a different mirror at the same time, Tattle explained with a mischievous smirk. Really? That's it? That sounds pretty easy, Jacob said. There's more to it than you're letting on, isn't there? Sylvie questioned. Tattle covered her mouth with a hand to hide her smile before nodding. Well, I guess we don't have any choice but to try it, she said, heading over to the other mirror. When she was in position, Sylvie looked to Jacob and found her looking to her with great determination in his eyes. She nodded to him, and he nodded back. Then the young couple looked deep into their own reflections. A moment or two passed before Jacob said, I don't think it's working. Me either. It's too bad whoever built these things didn't leave any instructions, Sylvie sighed. Wait, maybe they did, Tattle said, flying up and illuminating a small part of the back wall. Sylvie was surprised to find this temple had a message carved into the wall, written in Asgardian runes. Jacob immediately said, It's no good, I can't read it, in disappointment, but Sylvie was positive that she could. Wizard's candle, she commanded, casting a spell to summon a small blue orb that glowed like the sun and entirely illuminated the room. Do you remember if there was a message like this in that other temple, Jacob? There might have been. But now I'm second-guessing myself. The flame of fear was burning bright when we were in there, so I feel like we would have seen a message on the back wall like that, he said. Yeah, you're probably right, but I don't remember either, Sylvie replied. That's great, but what does it say? Tattle asked, barely able to contain her excitement. It says, Those of flame must join their hands, follow ambition through its command, at once through communion, temperance be at hand. But I have no clue what that means, she said, adding her thoughts in a somewhat mocking tone. Oh man, I think it's a riddle. Oh boy, we're probably gonna be stuck here for a while, Jacob said. Why do you say that? Tattle asked. I'm terrible at puzzles, he sighed in response. Sylvie nodded and added, It's true. Well, it's lucky you have me then. I might not get all of it yet, but the first part means you two have to hold hands while looking in the mirrors together. Then something about commands of ambition and temperance. But I'd wager you'll figure it out when you're looking into the mirrors, Tattle said smugly. Really? Well, I guess there's no reason we shouldn't try it, Jacob said before holding out his hand to Sylvie. She took it, and the pair stared into the mirrors together. It wasn't a moment before they felt something come over them, and suddenly they were pulled toward each other until they literally switched places, still holding hands as the environment around them shifted. The pair found themselves in a dark, empty void with water across the entirety of the floor, reflecting themselves back up at them. They looked around, wondering what the trial would entail, but outside of 4 kilns with burning blue flames in them, they stood in what seemed to be an empty void surrounded by a thick blue fog. After a few moments, something started rising from the water and Sylvie was greatly taken aback. She'd never seen him with her own eyes before, but Jacob had described his primordial god grandfather to her in detail, and she instantly recognized his glowing purple eyes. He was a huge half-man, half-dragon chimera with black scales that had gray ridges at the ends, making them look eerily like human fingernails. He also had horns on his head, claws on his hands and feet, a thick tail, and massive black wings extending from his back. Chaos! I should have known you would end up here, Jacob growled. He seemed surprised but angered when Chaos only chuckled at him. So, this is your ambition. Beating Chaos. I should have known, Sylvie said to herself, anxiety rising in her chest as doubt started swelling inside her. Chaos merely chuckled, evil written in his eyes. Sylvie jumped when she heard something more rising from the liquid behind her, shocked to find Jacob's sister Junia standing there with a frightful look on her face. She hadn't properly met her yet at this point, but she instantly recognized her from the Tournament of Champions, where she'd watched him do battle with her. She had somewhat long, straight brown hair, deep green eyes, and she was wearing a purple peplos with white pants underneath, as well as a pink choker sporting a heart on the side. Sylvie felt very uneasy as she looked from Junia to Chaos, not sure what she was supposed to do. Junia, what are you doing here? Jacob asked with distress. After a moment, Chaos lunged at Junia, and the doppelganger cowered in response, covering her head and crouching down to protect herself. Sylvie finally understood what she needed to do and jumped in with Jacob, each taking a vicious slice at Chaos, and putting themselves between them. Chaos leaped back from their attack, taking an aggressive stance at one side of the void. I'd bet it's not just about beating him. I think we have to do it while protecting Junia, she explained. Jacob's eyes went wide with recognition a moment before a serious expression she'd rarely seen settled over him. Jacob flourished his blade and set it alight before charging at Chaos and engaging him, barely missing swing after swing as the primordial dodged his every attack. Something about that seemed to sink into her in that moment. She knew Jacob had wanted to grow stronger to defeat his grandfather and make Midgard safer for everyone, but only now did she realize his true ambition. Protecting Junia meant everything to him, and she was going to do whatever she could to help him succeed. Chaos was making space from Jacob and circling around toward Junia, so without warning Sylvie sprayed frost at Chaos. But even here she felt herself growing apathetic. She continued just long enough to freeze Chaos over, glad her strength hadn't failed her in the process. Despite her effort, Sylvie gasped and took a step back when Chaos merely flexed and shattered the ice around him, entirely unhindered by its frozen restraint. Jacob lunged at his frozen grandfather before he broke free, but as the frightening god shattered the ice, he immediately grabbed Jacob by the throat and held him high in the air. Jacob gasped with fright and tried to say something, but it seemed Chaos had too firm a grip on his windpipe for him to speak. He dropped his blade as he reached up and grabbed at Chaos's clawed fingers, desperate to loosen his grip from his throat. Sylvie took action and leaped in, slashing her axe as Chaos stood there, but she was surprised when he entirely batted it aside and took a vicious slash of his own with his claws. She was knocked to the ground by the brutal gash across her shoulder, and she quickly struggled to her feet when she saw Chaos turn away from her and start towards Junia. Sylvie thought fast and pointed her axe at Junia, calling out, "High barrier!" surprising the images of both her and Chaos. Chaos seemed greatly displeased and took a heavy blow at the barrier, but the energy bubble surrounding Junia held strong and protected her. Sylvie smirked as Chaos looked back to her, still holding Jacob high and choking the life out of him.
Well, if I can't break the spell, I'll just have to break its caster,
Chaos said, before lunging at Sylvie. She was on guard and tried taking another swing at Chaos with her axe, but he simply allowed it to strike him before counterattacking, knocking her off her feet and disarming her with a single swift kick. Chaos hovered over her as he reached down and grabbed her by her top, lifting her up and smiling widely as he looked between Jacob and Sylvie. She knew there was only one way out of this, casting High Paralyze on Chaos. He struggled against it, but seemed shocked he was unable to break free. I get it. This is an illusion, so this Chaos isn't as strong as the real thing, she noted, finding it quite easy to uncurl Chaos's fingers from her top and drop back to her feet. She was moving to help Jacob, but he was able to free himself now that Chaos was restrained. On top of that, he seems vulnerable to magic, Jacob added hoarsely as he rubbed his throat and moved to protect Junia. Sylvie nodded, knowing what she had to do. The imaginary Chaos struggled against his magical restraints, but he was entirely unable to break them, confirming their thoughts on the matter. Having figured out how to break through the illusion, she went and picked up her axe and then sheathed it at her side before she held up a hand. Conjuring! Ethereal bow! She commanded. making a bow of pure magical energy appear in her outstretched hand. Jacob was awestruck but intrigued, and more so when she drew back on the string calling, "Arcane arrows!" which made 3 arcane arrows appear as though she'd drawn the bow with them in hand. Chapter 6. Remnant of War. She released the drawstring and the arrows flew straight into the fake Chaos, smashing into him and exploding before light started to pour from the image of Chaos itself and exploded far larger, wiping away the doppelganger entirely and leaving Jacob and Sylvie standing alone with the image of Junia. They were quite surprised when Junia's copy said, "Thanks, little brother," before sinking back into the reflective water. Jacob pleasantly said, "You're welcome," with a bright smile and wave as she disappeared into the darkness, and Sylvie couldn't help but chuckle at him. After a moment they looked around, wondering what came next. "So, that was my ambition. I wonder what we'll see for yours," Jacob asked, hoping Sylvie might give him a clue. I'm not really sure. I mean, there's lots of things I want to do, but," she started to say, trailing off when something arose from the water in front of them. After it had risen, it took form neither Jacob nor Sylvie had ever seen. He was a somewhat short man with short wavy red hair, a bushy red mustache, light blue eyes, and a somewhat charming look about him. Sylvie's bow vanished from her hand. He wore simple brown pants, a white button-up shirt, and brown suspenders, along with simple black leather boots and gloves, and a long black jacket draped over his shoulders. He stood there, smiling widely with his thumbs under his suspenders, and seemed to be in a pleasant mood. "Who exactly is this guy?" Jacob asked warily. "You don't want to know," Sylvie said with anger that surprised him. Jacob was more surprised to see just how rattled she was, her shoulders hunched up tight and the hair on the back of her neck and arms standing up. Sylvie walked right up to the man and asked him a simple question. "Why did you abandon us?" without a drop of mercy in her voice. "I'm sorry. I had another family, and I," were the only words that managed to leave his mouth before Sylvie absolutely decked him, punching him so hard in the face that he slammed into the ground before bouncing away from her. Sylvie stood over him, hyperventilating as the man sank back into the floor, but she and Jacob were both taken aback when a bright blue light filled the room. When the flash illuminated the room, they found themselves standing in the temple once again. When she had a grasp of herself again, Sylvie noticed she was holding a simple metal padlock. She looked at Jacob's hand and found him holding a key, but he didn't even seem to notice. Instead, he asked, "What the heck was that all about?" "I'd rather not talk about it right now. I'm sorry. I didn't want you to see that," she explained. Jacob was burning to talk about it and ask her all the questions on his mind, but he could tell something about it had hurt her greatly. He stepped up to her, dropping the key as he took her other hand and looked deep in her eyes. "It's all right. If you don't want to talk about it, we don't have to. I just want you to know I'm here for you when you need me. It's always okay to lean on me, all right?" he asked sincerely. Sylvie didn't answer. Instead, she dropped the padlock and wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing her face into his chest. Jacob accepted her, pulling her close and rubbing her back as he held her tight. "Well, that's all really touching, but you still haven't lit the flame of ambition, and I'm curious what that lock and key are all about," Tattle said, bringing Jacob back to reality. Yeah, me too. Sorry, I kind of forgot you were here. Could you, give us a minute?" he asked carefully, making the fairy cross her arms and scowl. "No, it's all right. I want to know about the lock and key, too," Sylvie said with a sniffle as she pulled herself together and released him. Jacob and Sylvie shared a gentle smile with each other before he bent down and picked up the lock and key. He inserted the key into the lock and twisted, and with a click the lock opened, and so too did the metal chest. "Hey, nice! I was wondering how we were supposed to open this," Jacob said, dropping the lock and key as they vanished and heading over to the open chest. He pulled the lid open wide, and inside was a simple torch with a pair of crystal shards, each sitting in a half sphere of glossy glass matching the color of the shard inside it. One was nearly black, and the other was light blue. Jacob picked up the torch in each crystal half sphere, careful not to let the crystal shards fall out as he pressed them together curiously, hoping they would join and become one. Despite his attempts, the crystal hemispheres remained separated. "What are we supposed to do with these things?" he asked himself. Sylvie reached inside and plucked the blue crystal shard from the half-sphere, but it didn't seem to do anything as she and Jacob examined it closely. After a moment, she picked up the nearly black one and was shocked when it burst into flames in her fingertips. She was so surprised she nearly dropped it, but more so when she realized it wasn't burning her at all. Black flames surged from the crystal, burning their way up her fingertips, but she was entirely unharmed by them. Well, that's odd. Why didn't this one? Jacob started to ask as he took the blue crystal shard from Sylvie and it too burst into flames. This one burned bright blue, but it wasn't nearly so deep or rich as the flame of ambition. I think I get it, Sylvie said, surprising both him and Tattle. The pair watched in suspense as Sylvie took her burning crystal shard and pressed it against Jacob's, making them both jump with fright when the crystals fused together and the flames combined, surging with new vigor. The bright blue and black flames mixed together around the crystals until a new, deep blue flame surged forth and roared to life. There it is, the flame of ambition. Yeah, all right! But wait, what do we do now? Jacob asked with premature celebration in his eyes. I think you're supposed to put those crystal spheres together now, Tattle said, with her hand on her chin. Jacob nodded and pressed them together, surprised when they still didn't fuse as the crystals had. Try putting them together around the source of the flame, Sylvie suggested. Jacob seemed to think that was a good idea and nodded before following her instruction. When the edges of the half-spheres of crystal touched with the flame of ambition burning inside, suddenly the whole thing changed color to the same deep blue as the flame and glossed over, becoming a shiny crystal orb with the flame of ambition contained within. Jacob's instincts took over and he held the orb to the tip of the torch, lifting everyone's spirits when the torch ignited with the brilliant blue flame. Without hesitation, he headed to the kiln and used the torch to light it, cheering with excitement when the kiln erupted with blue flame. Without warning, the torch went out, and the crystals all separated, all of them flying back into the metal chest of their own accord before it slammed itself shut tight. The message written on the back wall disappeared from existence, and the trio were left with nothing to do but celebrate their success in lighting the flame of ambition. All right, that's 2 flames down. Now just 2 to go, Jacob nearly shouted as he jumped for joy. Wow, I'm a little surprised you 2 actually pulled it off, Tattle said. Hey, what's that supposed to mean? Jacob demanded. Well, you seem like a bit of a dimwit, so I wasn't sure you'd be able to figure it out, even with Miss Sylvie's help. Hehehe, Tattle chuckled. Jacob immediately started trying to swat the fairy from the air as they hurled insults at one another, the pair causing a ruckus as Sylvie heard something outside. Stop! Do you hear that? She asked, making them each give pause. Tattle's face went pale. That sounds like... The alarm! She exclaimed before quickly flying back out the temple doorway. Sylvie gave Jacob a glance and he only nodded to her in silent agreement about what they should do. The pair didn't waste another moment and took off at great speed toward the city of the fairies, only barely catching up with Tattle as she reached the city limits and flew above it, gasping as she saw what set off the alarm. A short way inside the city was a frost giant, wildly waving his hands as he tried to smack down the fairies who were attacking him with tiny weaponry, no regard for the buildings or streets he was wrecking just by having walked into the city. He stood about a meter taller than Jacob, and his entire body was made of ice, save a small stone heart they could see through his somewhat transparent flesh. He was bald and had heavy, bushy white eyebrows that hung over his eyes, and a frosted icicle beard that poked downward, hanging just above his wide stomach. The frost giant also had a tree growing up the entirety of his body. It was a thin, narrow, pale tree with the occasional branch sticking out here or there, with thick, leafy foliage on it. Starting from the roots wrapped around his right foot, before wrapping around his leg, stomach, chest, and ending at his right shoulder where several branches cradled a bird's nest, though there was no bird in sight to speak of. Aside from that, he was wearing simple torn white robes that were pinned to his body by the growing tree, and he had a spear or harpoon through his stomach that didn't seem to be bothering him in the least. Tattle joined the fray and flew in, delivering a vicious slash to the giant's cheek, but he seemed entirely unfazed by the scratch she'd left him with. Thou mightly hooligans canst not reside in our lands. Avaunt or be doffed, for mine is the word of your king, he shouted at them. Jacob was completely lost and looked to Sylvie. Do you understand what that guy's trying to say? He asked. Not a word, she replied, just as lost as him. Either way, we can't let him destroy the fairy city. Jacob nodded and tossed her his blade, saying, Right, before leaping into the fray himself. Sylvie caught the massive blade in one hand and watched as Jacob moved in like a loosed arrow, quickly getting underneath the frost giant and delivering him a powerful upward kick in the throat, lifting him right off his feet. With a vicious spin, Jacob kicked the giant and sent him tumbling through the snow into the forest, making the fairies raise their arms in a victorious cheer. Jacob just looked back and said, Come on, before heading off after him. Sylvie leaped after him, catching up without issue before the pair arrived at the frost giant's feet. He had smashed through a tree and was struggling to get up, the eggs from the bird's nest broken and dripping through its partially crushed branches. Sylvie handed Jacob back his blade, and the young warrior stepped up to him, giving pause when he noticed 5 fairies, including Tattle, coming from behind them to provide backup. "Who are you, and what do you want?" Jacob demanded. "My name be Sycamore. Whom doth ye regard thou art? A peasant as thee shouldst be underfoot a-licking at mine leathers," Sycamore shouted back in an uppity tone. Wait, what did you just say?" Jacob asked. "He told you to lick his boots. Stand aside. Clearly this monster requires a more refined intellect than yours," Tattle said smugly as she floated ahead of Jacob and Sylvie. "Hey you, Sycamore, why are you attacking our city? What's your problem, anyway?" she asked furiously. "Mine problem? Thy lineage erected Ronyon towers upon staked land of mine imperial dynasty," Sycamore protested. Jacob and Sylvie were aghast, entirely unsure what was even going on anymore. "Well, this is our land now. Your dynasty is long extinguished. Now get away from our home and never come back," Tattle insisted. Sycamore forced himself to his feet with an angry scowl. "Thou dare defy the frost of mine ancestors?" Sycamore asked with fury as he got up. Jacob and Sylvie were having trouble following, but they understood what that had meant. "That's right. This land belongs to the fairies now. Get used to it or prepare for battle," Jacob called, flourishing the blade and setting it alight. Something about the burning sword seemed to take Sycamore's attention, bringing a sinister glare to the frost giant's eyes. "A mere peasant carries the saber of my long-fallen disputant? Verily, I shall venture lands not far, but mine is a will without distraction nor pity. Forget not my face, for this is nigh the last thou shalt behold it," Sycamore said before trudging off through the snow to the south. "What did he say?" Jacob asked, scratching his head. "I think he gave us a warning," Sylvie said carefully. "Yeah, he'll be back all right, and soon," Tattle agreed. Chapter 7. From Rage with Love. "So, what do we do now?" Jacob asked, his voice cracking from the trouble on his mind. "What can we do other than keep trying to light the kilns?" Sylvie asked with a heavy heart. We could go after him," Jacob said, unsure how she was missing something so obvious. "Part of me wants to, but we have something else we're supposed to be doing," Sylvie said with a shrug. "I mean, yeah, but just think. Those water people are in the direction he was heading, and they're all totally helpless," he decried. "It's not our fight, Jacob," Sylvie said sharply, giving him a glare to tell him to back down. "It won't be any fight at all. It'll be a massacre," Jacob replied quickly, stomping his foot furiously. Sylvie narrowed her eyes and pointed at his foot, making him jump from having triggered her pet peeve. He started to back up as she approached him, pointing her finger at his chest and raising it as she spoke. "You listen to me, Jacob Godley. I understand you want to help them, but before any of that, we need to find a way back home. Did you forget about your sister? How she'll never be safe unless we stop chaos? How are you going to save her when you're so busy saving other people that didn't even ask for your help?" she demanded, poking her finger right into his throat. "They can't ask for help. You know that," Jacob spat back at her with fury in his eyes. He backed up so far he backed right into a tree, and she pinned him there with her finger. "They can't ask or pray or even beg, Sylvie. How can we stand by and let that guy slaughter them?" "We don't have any idea if that's even a part of his intentions," Sylvie shouted back. "Well, we could go see," Jacob insisted, realizing she might be right. "Oh, good, and waste even more time here. What a great idea. I know. Why don't we ask the fairies if there are any more kingdoms around here we can save from some monster? I'm sure that would be a productive use of our time." "Did you forget we're supposed to be looking for Vidal's family? That his daughter may already be dead?" she shouted, grabbing fistfuls of his coat. "No, I didn't. I just don't want to risk any more lives in the process," Jacob said, grabbing her by the wrist. "No matter what we do here, there are people in danger, but these might be people right in front of us who we might be able to save. Are you really going to let their blood be on our hands?" he shouted. Jacob was thinking about what to say next, but he was greatly surprised when she slapped him across the face. "Let go of me. Now!" Sylvie growled. Jacob instinctively let go, shrinking from her as he shrunk down the tree to a sitting position. Sylvie rubbed her wrist for a moment before turning away from him. "I thought you were smart enough to see the bigger picture, Jacob. The worst part is, I'm not sure who that makes the bigger fool, you or me," she said. Without another word, she started walking away towards the next temple, not giving pause when he called out to her, begging her to wait. "Sylvie! Wait, Damn it! Are you fairies going to be alright if he comes back?" he asked, turning to where the fairies had been, but finding them no longer there, likely frightened off by their furious argument. Jacob was so conflicted he gasped out a grunt of frustration, not sure what he should do. He stood up and dug through his pockets, looking for the only way to solve this dilemma. "Well, there's only one thing to do at a time like this," he said, pulling a silver coin from his pocket. "Heads and I'll follow Sylvie. Tails and I'll go after Sycamore," he said, pensively holding the coin out in place on his thumb. He gave it a flip and caught it before hiding it from himself on the back of his hand. When he revealed it, he sighed deeply. Heads. It was heads, and now he was going to walk away from the people he'd just argued so hard to defend. But still, he'd let fate decide. He wasn't one to ignore the call of the universe. It only took him a minute or two to catch up to Sylvie as she trudged through the heavy snow near the edge of the forest. "So, you decided to do the smart thing and come with me?" Sylvie asked coldly. "I flipped a coin," he explained without enthusiasm, unable to meet her gaze. Sylvie was actually greatly surprised and put a hand to her chin. "I'm not sure if I respect that or if it's the dumbest thing I've ever heard," she replied. "Yeah, well, I guess it doesn't really matter now," Jacob said bitterly. Sylvie had only been teasing him, but his reply brought a deep frown to her face. "What? Don't tell me that's all it took to break your spirit," she asked with snark. Jacob finally looked at her, giving her the deepest glare he'd given anyone in a long time. Sylvie gulped with regret at her ill-timed joke, and the pair walked together in silence for quite a while. They broke free of the forest and had to cross a massive frozen lake, but deep under the ice they were able to see what looked like an entire kingdom coated in lava. It looked largely identical to the kingdom they walked across, though it seemed the outer walls and castle were gone entirely, leaving only a boiling volcano underneath. Sylvie tried to raise Jacob's spirits by pointing it out to him, and although he seemed curious for a moment, it faded quickly and he simply ignored her. "I wonder what could have happened here. Did the frost of apathy really create a whole landscape and lift it right off the lava kingdom? How could ice freeze over lava in the first place?" she asked, trying to get him to involve himself in the conversation. "I thought it wasn't our business anyway," he mumbled, looking away. "It's not, I guess, but it's kind of cool to think about, right?" she asked. He didn't answer. "Oh, come on. First you're Mr. Positive, and now you won't even have any fun? People's lives are at stake, Sylvie. I think it's time we both got a little more serious," he said cuttingly. She crossed her arms and puffed out her cheeks, frustrated he'd used her own logic against her. "Fine, you're right. Is that what you want to hear?" she asked. "Don't be childish," he scolded through a scowl. "I'm not being childish. You're being childish," she insisted. Jacob finally cracked a smile. She wanted to tell him to go fuck himself, but thought better of it after finally having helped improve his mood. "You're lucky you're so cute. You know that?" she asked coyly. "I guess we're both lucky then," he replied, smirking viciously at her. "Why's that?" "Because I'm cute enough that you can put up with me, and you're cute enough that I can't resist you," he said matter-of-factly, making her blush. "Yeah, I guess we are," she said with a chuckle. Jacob laughed too, and Sylvie found herself glad to have finally cleared the air between them. The couple chatted casually about things they enjoyed and wanted for the future as they made their way to the next temple. When they'd nearly arrived, Jacob looked up to the sky and shielded his eyes. "That's odd. We've definitely been here at least 5 or 6 hours, but the light hasn't changed at all. It's still broad daylight." "That is weird. You would think the sun would have..." "Right. We can't see the sun through that sheet of ice in the sky. I wonder how far it goes," Sylvie remarked, looking around the horizon to see if she could see the end of the ice that stretched across the sky. She couldn't. "Who knows? This place is definitely not right," he agreed. Jacob and Sylvie found themselves walking up to an empty encampment of crumbling buildings, debris, and the wreckage of what once seemed to be a full city, but the place was barren and lifeless. "Hey, doesn't this place remind you of that other ruin where those water folk were living?" Sylvie asked. "Kinda, but there's not a soul in sight," Jacob remarked. "Let's take a look around. Maybe those water beings are here somewhere and keeping themselves hidden." Sylvie only nodded in response, and the pair walked the streets of the ruined city for what felt like 2 hours or more, but there were no signs of the water people anywhere in the city limits. They saw many things, from another graveyard of blades to a monument of war that seemed to depict a fire giant, but it had been toppled over and largely smashed ages ago, many pieces coated over by fallen snow. But when they approached the temple, they found something that really caught their attention. It was what appeared to be a mass grave, filled with dozens of the water beings, all completely frozen over with signs of having been dragged there from a nearby campsite. It had been done recently, and there was a single pair of tracks in the snow, presumably from whoever had done this. Sylvie covered her mouth when they found it, her heart sinking into her stomach. "Oh my gods, look at these poor things," she said. She expected Jacob to say something, so she looked to him with distress when he didn't. He was just standing there, his eyes wide, his nostrils flared, and his teeth clenched so tightly she could hear them squeak in protest. His fist was clenched so firmly around the handle of his blade that blood started dripping from his hand and onto his sleeve. "They're going to die too," he growled. Sylvie gulped, expecting him to snap at her. She knew Jacob was talking about the other water beings near the Kiln of Fear. She could tell he wasn't just pissed, he was lividly furious, anger beyond words written in his eyes. Sylvie was about to speak, but she jumped when he walked right past her, his eyes unmoving from the mass grave's direction. Wordlessly, he walked up to the steps of the temple and headed inside. Sylvie followed after him, knowing there was little else she could do. When she entered, she was a little surprised to see Jacob standing there with his blade on his shoulder, a near hateful glare falling on her gaze as he waited for her. She gulped again, wondering what he would do or say. But she was surprised he was so focused when he pointed his blade up to the message written on the wall. "What's it say?" were the only words that passed his lips. Sylvie cast Wizard's Candle again, taking note that this temple was largely the same as the other two they'd visited so far. "Those of flame must stand apart, face the rage that's in their heart, exchange one's hate for a new start, and taste reflection so bitter and tart." "I guess we don't have to hold hands this time," Sylvie said. Jacob only said "good" as he took his place at the left mirror, staring into his reflection. Sylvie grimaced before taking her place at the right one. She stared into it for only a moment before she and Jacob were pulled towards each other, switching places again as the world shifted into a similar void to the last, the exception being that this place had kilns with dark red flames burning inside instead of the blue of the flame of ambition. She was surprised to find Jacob wasn't standing there with her, likely having been pulled into a void of his own instead of having joined her like last time. She felt uneasy as she stood and waited for whatever rose from the water, but nothing ever did. Instead, it was like the fog itself became a window that showed her all the things that angered Jacob. She saw many things, one after another. A young boy she didn't recognize who wasn't allowed to paint. His sister Junia being controlled. Damon's father lashing him and Jacob with a wooden switch. Chaos's glowing gaze. His mother Eris, goddess of discord. A dog starving, wounded, and left to die on the streets. A murderer killing lizard folk simply because of their race. Loki lying about freeing Joker. The chimera that killed Jacob's father, and so much more. She stared on in horror as horrible atrocity after nightmarish injustice happened before her eyes. But finally, when Sylvie was starting to worry that she couldn't take any more, at last the fog settled on one final visage. Jacob, sitting alone, hands and feet chained to the floor, surrounded by the bleeding corpses of his friends and allies, with nothing he could do to stop, help, or save anyone. Sylvie saw her own corpse lying not far from him, and covered her eyes, dropping to her knees and crying out in agony at the horrific sight. She had never imagined Jacob would have things so serious even cross his mind, but seeing it all laid out before her made it all feel a little too real. She rested on her knees, sitting there sniveling by herself, unwilling to remove her hands from her eyes and see the nightmare the fog was trying to show her. She didn't know how long she sat there, but she knew it was a few minutes at the very least, taking her far longer than she intended to gather herself. When she looked up, she finally saw what the fog was trying to show her. Jacob was still sitting there, chained to the floor and surrounded by the blood and bodies of his fallen loved ones. But then she saw Chaos step forward from the fog. He laughed heartily with his deep, gruff voice before saying one word that made everything click for her.
Weakling.
Suddenly, it all made sense. For a while, she'd started to wonder why this place was showing her what Jacob was afraid of, why it had been so insistent on her seeing the atrocities others were committing while Jacob was powerless to stop them. But then she finally understood. The thing that enraged Jacob the most wasn't the evil of the world. It wasn't the unfairness of nature. It was his own weakness, his own powerlessness to stop it. The one thing that enraged Jacob the most was himself. As the realization struck her, she stood up a little too quickly, and suddenly felt woozy as the world around her shifted, and she returned to her place in front of the mirror, holding the key this time. She nearly lost her balance, but she was surprised when Jacob was standing right there beside her, having caught her as she started to fall, but needing to drop his sword to do it. "Sylvie, are you all right?" he asked, seeming to have completely calmed down during their time apart. She latched onto him, pulling him close. "Jacob, I'm so sorry. I never imagined this was how you really felt," she said quietly. "What do you mean?" he asked with confusion. He was going to ask more but relented when she pulled him closer, pressing her face into her neck as she held him tightly. "For everything. I mean it," she replied. "I don't get it. What did it make you see?" he asked with concern. She only managed to shake her head in response. Her body was starting to tremble and her strength was crumbling away, nearly falling over and releasing him, but he held fast, not letting her go. "Sylvie, you don't need to apologize. Come on, I was being a jerk. Let's talk about," he started to say, but couldn't finish when Sylvie's strength returned to her and she pulled him into a passionate kiss. When they were done locking lips, they slowly pulled their faces apart and opened their eyes. Sylvie looked deeply into his eyes, unhindered by the queer confusion in them as she stared into his soul, searching for the spark of hope she always found there. It was only a moment before something in his gaze shifted and she saw the bright sparkle of determination in his eyes. She pulled away from him and smiled to herself. Jacob still seemed quite confused, but near instantly refocused when she took the padlock from him and inserted the key into it, turning it and opening the chest as had happened in the Temple of Ambition. The pair quietly walked to the metal chest and pulled open the lid, revealing another torch, but no crystals this time. Instead, they found a shield with another mirror literally set into the face of it. The shield's outer section, back, and end arms were dark red metal, and the mirror had a symbol of a flame carved into the reflective surface that took up nearly the entire face of the shield. It was heavy and deeply scratched all over, looking like it had likely seen use in warfare. Jacob picked up the shield and held it before him, looking it over before double-checking that they hadn't missed anything in the chest. Sylvie put the torch into the sheath of her axe, so they were sure they had it with them. "I don't get it. What are we supposed to do with this?" he asked. "I'm not sure. It doesn't really seem like the instructions mention it, outside maybe the part about reflection," she guessed. Sylvie and Jacob stared into the mirrored shield together, each wondering what they were supposed to do next. Chapter 8. Love is in the Air. The pair tried everything they could think of to light the flame of rage using the mirrored shield, but after a couple hours of trying they found themselves unsuccessful. Jacob seemed increasingly frustrated before finally giving up and tossing the shield aside, his curiosity buried by his wits failing him again. "Jacob, you can't treat such an important relic so carelessly," Sylvie scolded as she scooped up the shield. "Sorry, I just can't look at it anymore. I'm out of ideas," he said with frustration, sitting down and resting his face in his hands, blowing air out his mouth. "Yeah, me too," she said, sitting down beside him. "So what should we do now?" he asked. "I guess we should just move on. Maybe with some time we'll figure out how to light it and then we could come back," Sylvie suggested. Jacob looked to her a moment before nodding and standing up. "You know, that's pretty smart. I like that idea," he replied, sounding like it put him in a better mood. Sylvie stood up and strapped the shield to her arm. "Yeah, besides, there's only one temple left. I bet that's where we'll find Verdal's wife and son," she added, feeling good about it. "Oh, that's right," he said, sounding sick to his stomach. "What's wrong?" "Well, we found their daughter burned alive by the kiln of fear. I'm not sure if I can stomach seeing a little kid that way," he replied. Sylvie's heart sank, dread creeping over her. "Oh, right. And even if they are alive, we still have to tell them about their daughter," she choked. Jacob was looking at Sylvie, but she found herself unable to look back at him. He stared at her a moment before saying, "It's okay. I'll tell them," calmly and sadly. Sylvie took his hand and looked into his eyes, seeing hurt unlike any she'd ever seen there before. "I wasn't ready for how rough today was going to be," she said, unable to bear his gaze any longer. "Yeah, but at least we're here together," he replied weakly. She smiled and said, "Yeah, we are." With that, she found the strength to get to her feet, and Jacob followed suit, the pair exchanging a warm smile a few moments before Jacob grabbed up his blade and they left the temple. Sylvie watched Jacob carefully as they left, wondering if the sight of the frozen water folk might enrage or discomfort him again. but it was clear they were on his mind and he was trying to ignore them, entirely avoiding looking in their direction. The pair talked very little on their way from the Temple of Rage to the last remaining kiln, but their silence wasn't all that uncomfortable. They had just largely run out of things to talk about for the moment. They passed a large ruined building or monument resting in a small forest and largely buried by snow, but it didn't have a kiln inside, so the pair left it behind without paying it much attention. When they arrived at the surrounding area of the final temple, they found the area largely connected to the central mountain, sloping downhill the closer it got to the surrounding walls. The area was rocky and devoid of snow near the entrances to caverns that swept outward from the descending hillside. Steam rose from the cavern entrances, wafting shivering heat into the air. Jacob and Sylvie had expected another civilization to be living there, and despite the presence of many small white and pink birds, the place was devoid of humanoid life. The birds were flying quickly in and out of the caves, some seemingly returning, carrying small things like seashells, chunks of ice, and clusters of nuts, while others were just heading out, flying off well over the wall and out of sight somewhere. "Oh, wow. Look at these little guys. They're as busy as bees," Jacob said, admiring the birds. "Yeah, I wonder what they're doing in those caves," Sylvie asked. "It's probably where they nest." "Come on, let's check it out," he said with excitement. Sylvie wanted to keep him on task, but her curiosity was piqued nearly as much as his was. She followed him into one of the larger openings, and the pair found themselves inside a beautiful cave decorated with colored stones and seashells, featuring a huge pool of what looked almost like water taking up a large portion of the floor. I say what looked like water because both my mother and father described it as such, but adding that it looked off, being a surprisingly deep green, bubbling and sparkling as it shifted under the little light entered the cave. But the water was so reflective that it illuminated the entire place, making light dance along the walls. There were stone shelves on the walls and hanging from the ceiling, where the birds had made their nest, and the moment they stepped inside, suddenly all the noise went quiet, and every bird who'd been visible suddenly went into hiding as best they could. Sylvie was surprised when Jacob started whistling like a bird, and more so when she realized she understood what he was saying to them. "Hey, it's all right. We don't want to hurt you or your beautiful home. We were just curious, that's all," he whistled pleasantly. One of the pink birds poked his little head out from the hiding before whistling back. "Please just leave in peace. We don't want any trouble from giants," he pleaded. "We won't cause any problems, I promise," Jacob replied. The bird seemed reluctant to come out of hiding, and before the bird who'd spoken to him could reply, his little white partner came out of hiding and used a talon to pull him back to the nest by the feathers. The birds seemed quite mistrusting of them, and none came out to reply to Jacob's attempt to speak with them again. After about 5 minutes, he gave up and looked to Sylvie. "Well, they don't want to speak to us, so I guess we should just leave them alone," he said with a sigh. Sylvie nodded, and the pair left the cave quickly, headed towards the temple entrance they'd noticed on their way in. "By the way, how are you doing that?" Sylvie asked. "Doing what?" he asked. She replied, "Talking to the birds," having expected him to think it was just as unusual as she did. He seemed surprised, but responded, "Oh, I don't know. I've been able to for a couple of years now at least." "Can't you understand them?" he asked. Sylvie held up a hand and shook it back and forth, saying she sort of understood. "So, you could understand part of what they were saying? Interesting," Jacob said, putting a hand to his chin as he pondered it. "Well, I guess I understood it. What I'm confused about is how you were able to speak their language," Sylvie explained. "Oh, I see. Master Nike told me it's called beast speak, and supposedly anyone can learn it, but the only way you ever will is if the animals choose to speak to you specifically. Apparently, at some point in the past, an animal chose to speak with me, and I've been able to do it ever since," he explained with a smile. "Really? That's weird. I wonder why I understood it then," she asked. "Huh? What do you mean?" he asked. "Well, we have Scuggy at home, and I'm usually pretty comfortable around animals, but I don't ever remember ever hearing one speak to me. It just feels kind of odd that no animals have spoken to me if I can understand them, don't you think?" she replied. "Ah, now I get it. Animals aren't supposed to speak with humans or other mortal beings. They're only allowed to talk freely with the gods and other animals," Jacob explained. "Oh, really? I wonder why that is," she asked. "Nike said something about a vow of silence, but I was trying to figure something else at the time and don't really remember." He chuckled. "Maybe the gods don't want humans everywhere to understand beast speak for some reason, but I couldn't say what. You know how they are about their secrets." "Yeah, I do. It's so annoying. We're demigods. You would think we would have a right to know anything they could have to teach us, she replied. Apparently, in their eyes, we're not very different from mortals ourselves. Maybe someday that'll change, but I'm not really sure if I ever see that happening, he said, scratching the back of his head. Well, you know what they say. You've got to be the change you want to see in the world. Sylvie said with a chuckle, giving pause when Jacob stopped completely. She turned back and saw him staring at her, wide-eyed. What's wrong? She asked a little nervously. He blinked a few times before saying, Nothing. I've just never heard that before. Something about it just, I don't know, really struck a chord with me, I guess, he explained before quickly gathering himself and continuing on. You're weird. You know that? She replied with a smirk. I've gotta be if I'm gonna keep up with you, he replied cheekily. Sylvie said, Hey! And raised a fist, but Jacob started laughing as he ran to the temple entrance, making her chase after him. Get back here! Don't you run from me! She called after him. Just when Jacob made it to the steps, he was barreled over by Sylvie tackling him full force and pinning him to the ground. Ha! Now I've got you! You sure seem to think so, Jacob said with a huge smile. Sylvie was about to ask what he meant, but before she could, he used his legs to grab hold of her and flip them both right over, landing on top of her in the snow. So who's got whom now? He asked. She responded by slinging snow in his face, making him fall backward off her, laughing like a little kid as he scooped up snow to return fire. He stood up and drew back to throw, but surprised her when he dropped the packed snow and snatched the snowball Sylvie tossed right out of the air, his expression having gone grim but serious. Hey, sorry, but we need to hurry up and get inside, he said reluctantly, sounding like he had really enjoyed the idea of a playful snowball fight after the long day. He gently tossed the snowball to his side and stepped up to her, offering his hand to help her up. Sylvie took it and got to her feet, saying, You're probably right, with a sigh. She surprised herself when she shivered. Jacob took notice and immediately took off his coat, putting it over her shoulders. Here, let's get inside, he said, wrapping his arm around her back and starting toward the temple. Are you sure you won't be cold? Sylvie asked, though she already knew what his answer would be. Nah, you know me. I'm always warm. He chuckled. Then why did you even wear a coat? She asked. Well, in case you needed it, he admitted. She was about to say something but stopped when he added, Although, that does sound like an interesting way to train. If we could stay in the Arctic or volcanic areas for long periods, I'd bet we'd be able to survive nearly anywhere. I'd try it. It sounds kind of fun, living out in the wild somewhere, Sylvie said, making him smile at her. The pair finished climbing the temple's front steps and entered, finding themselves surprised that this one seemed quite different from all the others. Its main chamber was empty save the unlit kiln, an entrance to a side room that looked quite like the empty barracks from all the others, and a large, heavily decorated nest resting on a shelf hanging from the ceiling in front of the kiln. The focal point of the nest being a large handle that looked somewhat like a lever sticking out from the center. Unlike the other temples, this place had no mirrors and no chest resting before the kiln. Jacob let Sylvie go and immediately jogged to the barracks, poking his head inside before quickly returning. There's no one here, he said with concern. Sylvie stopped walking in with surprise when Jacob ran toward the kiln and jumped up in the air to look inside, landing on and sliding down the wall before touching back down to the ground and rejoining her. Nobody up there either. But there are some birds in that nest. Maybe we should ask them, he said nervously. They probably gave up and went to go meet with, Sylvie said before realizing what she was saying and covering her mouth. Jacob gasped with fright. That means they're going to run into, Jacob said, realizing what Sylvie had just a moment before. He was about to say something else, but jumped with surprise when the little bird tweeted at them. Hey, keep it down, would ya? My baby's arresting, the little pink fellow said, hopping up from the nest onto one of the branches it was made out of and shaking his feathers at them. Oh, more giants, he squawked with surprise. Hey, do you know what happened to the people who came here to try and light the kiln? Jacob whistled. People? The ones like you? Yes, they're still inside now. But please keep your voice down, he replied. Inside? Inside where? Sylvie asked quietly, looking back toward the door to the barracks. Jacob had already checked inside. The bird seemed surprised. Inside where? Inside here, trying to light the kiln of love. Are you here to perform the ritual as well? He asked, shaking his feathers toward the kiln. Yes, we are, Jacob said quickly, surprised when the bird smirked at him. All right then, but don't say I didn't warn you. Love is a lot of things, kid. I hope you're ready for one tough challenge, the little bird tweeted. Before either of them could respond, the bird hopped away before quickly hopping back up with a narrow chain in his talons. The bird flew like it was riding a whirlwind around them again and again, chaining the pair together so Jacob stood on the left with Sylvie tied to his right. He couldn't use his right arm, and she couldn't use her left, and their right and left legs, respectively, were chained together. It was so sudden that Jacob dropped his sword and Sylvie dropped her shield. The couple couldn't even walk unless they moved their inside leg together, and Sylvie gulped as she suddenly realized what was going on. Jacob was a little slower on the uptake and shouted, "Hey, what's all this about? Let us go right now, you stupid parrot." "Parrot? Kid, you're funny. Lovebirds chained up by a lovebird. There's gotta be a joke in there somewhere." He snickered through his beak. "Lovebirds? That's what you are?" Sylvie asked with surprise, making him nod proudly. "That's right, little lady. Now if you two are done squawking at me, I'll open the door and you can head inside to face the rituals. All you have to do if you want to light the kiln is break those chains of love. Now get going," he tweeted, hopping onto the lever sticking out of the middle of his nest and pushing it down. Jacob and Sylvie were taken aback when the entire wall behind the kiln opened up down the middle and pushed forward giant stone doors relieving a long downward staircase to the first challenge. "Hey, hold on a second. Do we really have to stay chained up like this? I can barely move," Jacob protested, but the bird only snickered at him. He was surprised when Sylvie looked to him. "If it's part of the ritual, we'll just have to make the best of it," she said calmly. Jacob seemed reluctant, and instead of answering, he struggled against the chains a moment, trying to see if he could break them with brute force alone. Despite his divine strength, it seemed he was totally unable to break them. "Relax, Jacob. It's okay. We each still have an arm and a leg we can use independently. We'll just have to stay focused on working together, all right?" she asked. Jacob sighed heavily, but it seemed her words had helped him gather his nerve. "Okay, I'll follow your lead then," he agreed. Sylvie nodded, agreeing that was probably for the best. "Okay, step with your outside leg first. We'll do that to try and set a good pace for the both of us," she instructed. Jacob nodded and followed orders as the pair struggled just to walk normally. Luckily, it seemed her strategy was effective, and they managed to walk through the room and down the descending staircase with little issue. Chapter 9. The Effort Love Takes. The pair only tripped once on the stairs right near the end. Luckily, they were able to catch themselves on the level ground at the bottom. They had to work together to sidle through a narrow doorway, but inside they found a huge room far larger than they'd expected. It seemed to be an underground atrium of sorts, the center of which was occupied by a huge sycamore tree that had patchy, mottled bark of pale white, brown, and green flaked off in irregular patterns. It stood nearly 60 meters high and branched off into a few different trunks a couple meters from the roots. And it reached the ceiling with a few stray branches, along with having several leafy buds and spined seed pods hanging from its leafy branches. Seed pods were haphazardly strewn about the floor, and the leaves themselves were a beautiful dark green with tinges of gold and vein-like patterns dancing across their surface. Beyond the tree there was an angled window where sunlight shone through, having several angled mirrors around the edges that reflected light to other mirrors that shined down onto smaller patches of gardens, some bearing fruits and vegetables, and others seeming to be simple flower gardens. One stream of light even flowed through a gap in the wall to another room, which brings me to the fact that there were also 4 doors, one near each corner of the room. "A big tree. What's so special about it that it gets a whole garden like this?" Jacob asked. "I guess we'll find out soon enough," Sylvie said with a curious grin. "But still, that tree's gigantic. It must be ancient," she added. Jacob only responded by saying, "Yeah," as his eyes darted around the room, anxious to take in every detail. Sylvie was going to direct him to follow her, but jumped with surprise when his stomach growled loudly. "You don't think they'd mind if I borrowed a couple of those tomatoes, do you?" "We probably shouldn't. This place looks like less of a trap than the others, but that actually makes me more nervous," Sylvie said. Jacob frowned deeply and sighed, but relented. "Don't worry, we'll go to Valhalla and eat a big dinner when we get home, okay?" she asked with a smile. He smiled back cheekily when her stomach also growled loudly in response, making her blush brightly. "Yeah, all right. I guess it isn't helpful to complain when we're both pretty hungry," he said. She nodded. With that, the couple shuffled around the room, looking for clues as to what they should be doing. The floor on the far right was blocked by metal bars, and the other 3 were open. They started with the open door on the right, leading to the room where the light was reflected through the opening in the wall. The light bounced off more mirrors inside, reflecting down upon a small, empty plots, all except 2 that had small shrines sitting in the bright light, a single flower having blossomed from a pot in the center of them. Both flowers seemed unique, and neither Jacob nor Sylvie could identify them. But my parents never really had eyes for gardening. The shrines looked hand-built and were unique from each other, both having their own distinctive features and designs. There was also a pile of building materials from stacks of wood, nails, and rope, to tools like handsaws, hammers, and a workbench in the corner with a light of its own. "Oh, I think I get what we're supposed to do," Jacob said. "Really?" Sylvie asked, making him nod. "Yeah, I think we've got to build a shrine like these others and grow a flower like those ones," he explained, pointing with his free hand. "Are you sure? I feel like that will take a long time," she said. "Well, I don't see anything else that it seems like we're supposed to do in this room. Why else would it be full of building equipment?" he asked. "I don't know. I just thought they might be left over from the temple's construction. But this whole place is made of stone. Why would they have so much leftover wood?" he disagreed. "Oh, you're right. That wouldn't make sense. Still, maybe we should check around the other rooms before we waste a bunch of time trying to coordinate on something like that," Sylvie suggested. Jacob put a hand to his chin before nodding. "All right, I guess that's fair at least. We don't want to waste time here if we can help it," he agreed. The couple headed back to the main room before trying the first door on the left. This room was surprisingly empty save a pair of rusted watering cans and a large pile of molten rock that narrowed as it ascended like a miniature mountain, coming to a peak shaped like a long knife sticking straight out of the top. The pair were entirely baffled by the room, finding nothing but a little dried blood inside the watering cans, and nothing else of interest besides some medical supplies. The last room was somewhat large. More than half of it was filled by a large pond and had numerous fish swimming inside, along with plentiful plant life. The other half had a fairly small pottery kiln and work area that featured a potter's sculpting wheel on one side and a single cow in a small fenced enclosure on the other. "Well, this room's busy. What the heck are we supposed to do here?" Jacob asked in exasperation. "Well, I'm not totally sure, but this room makes me think you might have been right about building a shrine in that other room. I'm thinking we might find materials to craft a plant pot in this room, and judging from the cow, I'd say we're meant to take some soil and manure as well," she conjectured. Jacob's eyes darted from one spot to another before he said, "Hey, that's pretty clever. I'm surprised you could figure all that out with just a quick glance around the room." "Well, it just makes sense, I guess. That room only had the shrines, the other one had watering cans, and this one seems focused on supplying pottery. And the central room is full to the brim with plants," she explained. "Yeah, I agree. Maybe the temple is trying to teach us something about love," Jacob offered. Sylvie saw he was blushing and found her cheeks flush as well as she nodded. "So this seems like a smart place to start since it will take the pot a while to fire. But still, where are we supposed to get the clay?" "I've heard clay is often found at the bottom of shallow ponds, lakes, and other water sources, so that would be my guess," Sylvie said, pointing to the pond. Great. I guess we're gonna have to get our boots soaked since we can't take them off while chained together like this," Jacob bellyached. "Oh, boo-hoo. I've seen you get stabbed through the chest and keep fighting. You can handle some wet boots," Sylvie asserted. Jacob sighed again and reluctantly agreed. The pair walked up to the pond, and Jacob kicked the boot off his free leg before reaching down and yanking off his sock, making Sylvie sigh and side-eye him as she waited for him to finish getting ready. "What's that look for? If I take my boot off, I'll be able to feel it if we step on some clay," he said. Sylvie realized that was actually a pretty good idea since the water was rather murky and followed suit, taking the boot and sock off her free leg. When they were ready, they stepped into the pond and had to work together to wade deep into the water, nearly up to their chests before Jacob jumped with surprise. "I think I found some," he said with excitement. "Okay, but how are we supposed to get it while we're chained together?" she asked. "Step back with me," Jacob offered, surprising her. Like a couple of steps from the spot before Jacob raised a hand and extended it like he were grabbing at the ground, closing his fingers around the open air and lifting it up. Sylvie jumped with fright when a large ball of dirt and clay rose from the water and floated in the air in front of him. With a wave of his hand, Jacob commanded it to drift over to the pottery workspace before setting it down gently. "Smart. I hadn't even thought about using elementalism, since it isn't safe to use fire or ice here," she reflected. "Yeah, luckily it seems like earth and plant elementalism are just fine, though." Besides, now it will be a lot easier to get out of here, he added, before gently waving his hand again and lifting it up slightly. From the water rose a set of packed dirt stairs from where they were standing, leading safely out of the pond. Jacob was smiling proudly the entire way out of the pond, and Sylvie was somewhat impressed by his resourcefulness. The stairs made it much easier to shuffle out of the pond, and the pair left their boots and socks right at the mouth of it so their feet could dry off before putting them back on as they headed over to the clay. Jacob used elementalism and cleanly separated the clay from the dirt and rock by sight and squeezed the water out. Next, he spun it quickly in the air to shape it into a simple pot. They were startled when the cow mooed behind them, but after seeing it was just a regular cow doing regular cow things, they paid it little attention. Last, they needed to light the firing kiln. Sylvie was surprised when Jacob reached a hand out toward the wall, and a moment or two later some scrap wood floated in from outside, beckoned from the room with the shrines by my father's abilities. He set them under the kiln and pointed toward the pond. "We've got to go get some of that dead grass to use as kindling," he said. Sylvie nodded, and the pair worked together to head toward the grass sticking out of the pond and gather some dead weeds. When they had enough, they headed back to the kiln, and Jacob used just the spark of fire elementalism to light it, but he was taken aback when the flame was deep blue, the color of the flame of ambition. Sylvie jumped with fright, saying, "Put it out, quickly!" Jacob did as she bid him and put out the fire. "But then, how are we supposed to light the kiln?" he asked. "Can you make a dowel rod from one of those pieces of wood?" "We'll just have to light it the old-fashioned way," she said. Jacob followed her instruction and created a thin dowel from a piece of wood, and together the pair set the kindling on a piece of wood and worked as a team to spin the rod fast enough to create a spark, catching the kindling alight with a normal red flame. They set the fire in the kiln, and the whole thing started heating up quickly as they fed and fanned the flames. Once it was good and hot, Jacob carefully set the pot in the furnace and closed it up, letting it fire the clay while they moved on. The pair headed back to the room filled with building supplies, and Sylvie was a little surprised when Jacob was able to completely construct their shrine within a few minutes. He didn't even need nails, simply fusing the pieces of wood together until they formed a cute little house without a roof, just big enough for their plant pot. When he was finished, he set it under one of the beams of light before the pair returned to the main room. "So, what kind of flower do you think we should get?" he asked, looking around at the garden and finding many flowers he thought were quite beautiful. "I don't think that's what we're looking for," Sylvie said, eyeing the tree. "What do you mean? The other pots had flowers in them," he noted. "Yeah, but neither of them looked like any of these flowers." "No, I think I know what we're supposed to do," Sylvie said, bringing him closer to the grand tree in the center of the atrium. Sylvie reached out and plucked one of the many spiky seed pods from the tree before opening it up and finding a blood-red seed inside. "I think this is what we're supposed to use," she said, showing him the seed. He seemed surprised at first, but brought his hand to his chin as he thought it over. After a moment he nodded, saying, "You may be right." She nodded back, knowing she was. After that, they went back to the room with the watering cans, picking one up. Sylvie started leading Jacob back toward the furnace room, but he stopped her. "Hang on, don't you think filling these with water seems too easy?" he asked. "What are you talking about? What else would you water a plant with?" she asked. "Yeah, but look inside. These cans have been used for something other than water, don't you agree? Besides, that big mound in this room feels like it would be oddly out of place if we didn't even need to use it." "Well, what do you suggest?" she replied. You're gonna think I sound crazy, but the top of that mound sticks up like a knife, and this puzzle is about us working together, right?" he asked. She nodded to him. "So I was thinking, maybe we're supposed to climb that mound and cut our arms, and catch our blood in this watering can so it mixes together." "I guess, but why not just give us a knife at that point? What's up with the weird mound it's on top of?" she asked. "I'm not sure, but I've got a gut feeling about it," he said. Sylvie seemed surprised, but shrugged. "Well, we'll have to be careful climbing up there, but I guess you have a point. Besides, there's no harm in trying it," she agreed. It took effort to coordinate themselves up the rocky mound, but they still managed to get to the top quickly. "This thing is really hot to the touch. I'd bet if we'd brought the kindling in here it would have burst into flames on its own," she said as they nearly reached the top. "Really? I hadn't noticed," Jacob said, putting the back of his hand against the stone and finding it only a little warmer than his own skin. The pair finished their climb and positioned themselves at the top so they didn't accidentally lose balance and hurt themselves. "Hey, look, there's a divot here that seems perfect to hold the watering can, and there's even a little drainage rail in the stone that leads right up to it," he said, tracing the indent from the can to the knife-like erection with his finger. "Yeah, you're right. but I still don't really like it. Let's hurry and get this over with. Sylvie slowly lifted her arm and brought it to the blade-like stone, but she hesitated, pulling her arm back down. Can you go first? Something about this is making me really nervous. Yeah, no problem, he agreed, putting his arm up to his mouth and using his teeth to pull down his sleeve before raising it to the pointy protrusion. Jacob gulped before running the full length of his forearm from the end of his elbow to the side of his wrist across the blade, grunting slightly as he finished. Blood poured from the open wound for a moment before his healing factor closed it back up. Still, they'd gotten a fair amount of blood into the can. Sylvie had hoped watching him do it first would steel her nerves, but for some reason she found them more shaken. She sat a moment as Jacob pulled his sleeve back down before he asked, "What's wrong?" "Nothing. I just don't really want to cut myself. I know it won't hurt for long, but I feel a little dizzy just thinking about it," she admitted. Jacob nodded. "All right, well, let's take a minute for you to catch your breath, and then I'll help you do it, okay?" he asked. She nodded gratefully, glad he was there to support her when she needed him. Sylvie took a few moments to gather herself, and when she finally did, she looked Jacob in the eyes and saw determination in his stare. With a gulp, they took each other's hands, and Jacob guided her arm to the bladed stone before gently running it along the edge. Sylvie winced as the hot stone cut into her skin and blood poured from her arm, finding herself grateful when the experience was over and her wound closed up. But then something unexpected happened. As soon as the blood from her arm drizzled down and touched the blood in the can, they both jumped with surprise when the liquid inside burst into pink flames. The flames didn't seem to be burning away the blood as no smoke came from them. Sylvie was a little surprised when Jacob grabbed the can by the handle and sniffed the inside, seeming to think it smelled funny. But after a moment he said, "Oh, so this is how we were supposed to light the kiln. Maybe. I guess that would make sense. But then, does that mean we're supposed to water the flower with our blood?" she asked. "Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's got the flame of love burning from it, right? That's got to be a sign we're looking in the right direction, right?" he asked. "I didn't even think about that. Yeah, you're probably right," she agreed. "Come on, let's go check on the pot and get everything set up." After that, the pair worked together to head back to the firing kiln. Jacob opened the furnace right up and pulled the pot from it with his bare hand, seeming entirely unbothered by its scorching surface. He gave it a few pinches and poked at it all over before saying, "It seems solid. Now we just have to let it cool. So what should we do while we wait? We're basically done at this point, right?" she asked. "Yeah, but we can't exactly fill it with soil just yet. If the plant is in the pot and the soil's too hot, it probably won't grow," he said. "This is really intricate. I'm surprised it's supposed to take this long," Sylvie said. "I kind of am too, but you know what they say, patience and understanding are the cornerstone of love. Besides, in a few ways, we kinda used elementalism to cheat. If we hadn't, then we could have pulled the pot out of the furnace and left it to cool while we built our shrine," he remarked in return. The pair went and put their socks and boots back on before heading over to the pottery workspace to rest and wait. It took a fair amount of effort and coordination just for them to sit down, finding it somewhat uncomfortable to sit on the chains, but still nice to be getting some rest. Sylvie took several minutes thinking before either of them had anything else to say. "Jacob, it's okay if you think it's too early or you're not sure yet, but do you love me?" she asked. Jacob was taken aback and blushed brightly. "Well, yeah, I think I do. Do you feel the same?" he asked, barely squeaking out the words. "Yeah, I do. I wasn't so sure before today, but I think now I'm sure of it," she said, her cheeks going bright pink. Jacob took her bound hand in his and rubbed the back of it with his thumb, smiling at her. She looked back at him and smiled too, smitten with his handsome grin. "I love you, but don't think that means I'm letting you off easy for getting us trapped here. You're still in big trouble," she said, trying to hide her smile that stretched from ear to ear. "And I love you." "Man, there's something so surreal about actually saying it," he said, looking up to the ceiling as he ignored her redirection entirely. Sylvie looked to her feet, one leg still chained to his as she smiled to herself. "I know, it's kind of freeing, isn't it?" she asked. She looked back at him when he didn't respond, but found him still staring up at the ceiling, a dreamy, faraway look in his eyes. She pulled him a little closer and rested her head on his shoulder, and the pair waited there for around an hour, talking lightly about their dreams for their future together. When they thought it had been long enough, they stood up and Sylvie checked the pot, finding it had cooled more than enough. So with that, they gathered the pot and the watering can and Jacob made a mixture of dirt and manure from the cow's pen using elementalism, filling the pot before they carried it to the room with the shrines. There, Sylvie placed the sycamore seed into the pot and covered it up before they set it into the shrine. "I sure hope this works," Jacob said nervously before pouring the burning mixture of their blood from the watering can over the seed. They waited a few moments before Jacob sighed. "Oh man, we must have messed up somewhere," he said dejectedly. "No, look," Sylvie said excitedly, pointing to the pot. There in the soil, something shifted. Then after a moment, a tiny stem sprouted up from the ground, growing rapidly as a bud grew at the tip. Chapter 10. Love, Loss, and Letting Go. The flower slowly rose from the soil with its bud growing rapidly, but they were both absolutely stunned when it sprayed a red mist at them, engulfing them before they could react. Jacob and Sylvie coughed as they tried to gather themselves and wave away the mist, but they both jumped with fright when their chain suddenly loosened, and they heard a loud sound like banging metal from the main room. They were both a little fearful as the chain loosened so much it fell off them before seeming to gain a mind of its own and wrapping itself around the arms they'd had inside of their earlier union, tying Jacob's right arm to Sylvie's left arm. Surprisingly, there was also a length of chain between them, hanging between their arms just off the ground. "Oh man, I was hoping this meant we broke the chains," Jacob said dejectedly. "If it did, wouldn't that mean Verdal's family would have succeeded before we got here, since they weren't anywhere in the rooms we could explore?" Sylvie offered. "Oh hey, I guess you're right." "Oh well, at least we can walk properly now, even if we are still chained together," he replied. Sylvie nodded happily, glad to not be running a three-legged race anymore. The pair quickly returned to the main atrium, where they found the door that was previously barred shut was now open. They headed inside and found themselves in a fairly long hallway. They were about to start walking down when they jumped, hearing a little boy cry, "Mommy!" from deeper inside. Without thinking, they ran to the end, finding themselves standing in a large room over a pit of boiling lava with several columns erected from it, each barely wide enough and with just enough room between them for a pair of adults to barely stay on separate adjacent platforms if they had their chained arms fully outstretched toward each other. There at the other end of the room, but still several platforms from the end, they spotted a woman with long white hair and a bright yellow dress that had a prominent white collar buttoned all the way up. She had her right arm chained to her little son, a boy who didn't look older than 6. He had short, messy white hair and wore a blue winter coat and some brown pants, but he had terror in his red eyes as he dangled by his left arm, desperately holding onto the chain for dear life as his mother pulled him up to her. The pair worked together and barely got him pulled up, the mother looking like her strength was nearly exhausted from having crossed the room by her having to continuously carry him across. "Are you all right?" Jacob called with shock when the mother got her son onto their platform. She looked exhausted and desperate, holding her son tightly to her so they could rest a few moments before proceeding. They were beyond shocked to hear someone calling out to them, but after the mother gathered herself, she called, "Fine, but winded. I just need a couple minutes," she replied, struggling to catch her breath. Jacob nodded and looked at Sylvie, who shared the strong-willed look in her eyes. Their pair quickly plotted a path and leaped across the gaps with ease, finding that since they were both adults, the chain was just barely long enough for them to make it across, if they worked together. And after all the teamwork they'd had to use navigating the previous puzzles, their cooperation had improved drastically in a short time. They made it right up to the mother and child in less than a minute before Jacob gave out instructions. "You two hold on to each other tight, and Sylvie, get ready. I'm gonna hop to their platform, and then we'll jump straight to the end in a single bound, okay?" "Got it," Sylvie agreed. "Hold on a second, maybe we should," the mother started to protest, but she was shocked when Jacob went forward with his plan without their permission, hopping over and quickly snatching them up before the pair leaped through the air and landed at the far end of the chasm, now completely out of harm's way. When he set them down, the mother and child gasped with relief, having held their breath in fright of the long jump. "Thank you so much. That was so terrifying, and we spent so long trying to cross it," the mother said breathlessly. The boy seemed just as exhausted by the experience, dropping to his knees in relief. "Don't worry about it. We're glad we can help," Sylvie said brightly, making Jacob nod. "Now then, are you the wife of King Verdal? It's only just dawning on me that he forgot to tell us your name." "Yes, I'm Queen Feli of Verdal, and this is our youngest son, Robin." "Thank you again, but just who are you two?" she asked. "I'm Jacob Godley, and this is Sylvie Freya's daughter. We sort of accidentally fell from Asgard and landed down here, but your husband asked us to help him find you all and light the kilns if we can." So far we've only lit one, but I'd wager we're getting pretty close to lighting this one, he introduced. Do you have anything to eat? We've been trapped in here for a while now, and poor Robin is starving, Felia begged, tears in her eyes. Now that Sylvie looked closer, she could see both of them looked quite weak. They'd definitely been at least a day or more in this room. No, I'm sorry, we don't, Sylvie said sadly as her stomach growled too, making them both hang their heads. She was thinking about what to do next when Jacob said, Hey, don't worry. Sylvie and I are going to solve whatever puzzles are left and get you out of here. Then we'll take you back to your husband and son, and you can have a good rest while we go out to light the other kilns. Just hang in there. It'll only be a short wait from now, he said charmingly. Felia and Robin looked like their prayers had been answered as light returned to their eyes, but then Sylvie realized something. They still hadn't told them. She tugged on his sleeve and quietly said, Actually, Jacob... But she was greatly surprised when he rapidly shook his head with a wild look in his eyes, quickly holding out his hand for her to stop as if he sensed her intentions before swiftly putting it back down so the mother and son didn't notice his gesture. She didn't know quite what to make of it, but held her tongue, deciding that since Jacob felt so strongly about it, it might be best to respect his wishes. All right then. Do you need to rest a few moments, or are you ready to try and get out of here? Jacob asked cheerfully, noting they'd finally caught their breath. I'm ready, Felia said, looking to her son, who only nodded sheepishly. Jacob said, Great! The sooner we get out of here, the better. The four of them walked to the door and entered the next room, finding themselves in a lavish dining room, with only one other door that looked wide open. The place was huge and had the largest dining table any of them had ever seen, that was surrounded by chairs and had dozens of plates on it, with piles of steaming hot delicacies from around the world. Sylvie and Jacob stopped cold as their jaws dropped open, mouths watering at the sight of the fantastic feast laid before them. Felia and Robin stepped inside, and the young boy literally leaped with joy before running toward the table, dragging his mother alongside him. She didn't resist. She'd just been so stunned that she stood with the young couple a moment before her body caught up with her. They went right up and started feasting away, overjoyed to finally have something to eat after being trapped in the temple for days on end. Jacob was just starting to step forward too, as his and Sylvie's stomach growled angrily at their resistance, but she stopped him. Hold on a second. This is clearly a trap, she remarked. Jacob jumped with surprise at her accusation, but it seemed that Felia and Robin hadn't even heard her or the sounds of their ravenous feasting. Jacob put his hands on his hips and asked, What kind of trap? Poison? I'm not sure, but this is clearly just way too easy. Besides, for all this food to be hot and fresh like this, there's clearly magic at work here, Sylvie explained. Well, yeah, but what's so different between this magic food and the dining halls in Asgard or on Mount Olympus? They have food spawning spells on them, but there's nothing weird or wrong with them, as far as we know, he added, putting his hand to his chin for his final thought. That is true. Wait, I know. Identify, Sylvie commanded, pointing at one of the piles of food on the table. Suddenly runes appeared in her mind's eye, giving her a full description of the food she pointed at. At first, everything seemed normal, but she gasped in surprise when she noticed an enchantment on the food near the end of the list. Huh? Oh, I get it. This is a test of restraint, she said. The pair were startled when Felia and Robin both flopped over, passed out in their chairs with food still in their hands. What the? Jacob asked. It's all right, Sylvie explained. They're just asleep. This food is enchanted to put you to sleep after eating a certain amount of it. It's a vicious cycle meant to make you wake up hungry, eat just enough to keep you alive, and then make you pass out again. So that's why the door is wide open, Jacob realized. He winced when his and Sylvie's stomachs growled again. Oh, but I'm so hungry. Can't I just have a bite? He begged. Absolutely not. We've got to take them and get going. Like you said before, we've got to be near the end by now, she insisted. Jacob sighed, but relented, going and picking up Felia over his shoulder as Sylvie carried Robin. She was beside herself when Jacob tried snagging a drumstick and smacked it out of his hand. He flinched and chuckled nervously as she glared at him, before they headed through the door together. They entered a small room with vents on both sides and with only a door in front of them, but they both jumped with surprise when the door they entered through slammed shut behind them. A purple gas poured into the room, surprising them when they didn't feel anything. They jumped again when the chains wrapped around their arms loosened again, dropping off them completely and leaving them each holding an end with the full length of chain dropping to the floor between them with a clatter. The same thing happened to the chains around Felia's and Robin's arms, but of course they were fast asleep, so they let them go. The whole thing dropped to the ground with a clatter. Just then the door in front of them opened. Jacob picked up the chain belonging to the Vidal family, wrapping it thrice over his shoulder before they continued. They found themselves in a long room that had a somewhat narrow bridge crossing a seemingly bottomless pit. At the end of the bridge was a gap they couldn't see past to the wall, and they couldn't easily spot any door from where they were standing, especially when you consider that there were large swinging pendulums covering the bridge blocking their view. The pendulums hung from the center of the ceiling, dangling axe heads and swinging them back and forth across the room, just barely cutting into the bridge and leaving slash marks all across its surface where they'd cut shallow grooves that'd gone smooth from repetition. Sylvie was surprised when Jacob raised a hand and held up 2 fingers like a pair of scissors, cutting the air with them and making her jump when the pendulums flew right off their mechanisms, crashing into the wall or bridge before dropping down out of sight. They never even heard a sound from down below. "Jacob, that's cheating," Sylvie said. He just chuckled at her. "Maybe, but I'd rather keep us safe than risk the lives of these 2 accidentally. Wouldn't you?" he asked coyly. Sylvie grumbled to herself and stepped forward, surprised when she stepped on a pressure plate that sunk into the stone. She quickly stepped back, but breathed a sigh of relief when a tower shield that looked somewhat like a turtle shell rose from the floor a few steps in front of them. "A shield? Neat," Jacob said, stepping up to grab it. "Wait," Sylvie said, her worst fears confirmed when Jacob stepped on a pressure plate too, but from this one came a volley of arrows from some hidden slots in the wall to their left. Luckily, he was more than fast enough to grab the shield and defend himself and Felia using it. "Whew, that was a close one," he said. "I know, you've got to be more careful," she insisted. "Sorry, I didn't expect another trap to be so close to the first," he explained. "Come on, stay close to me. I'll protect us." "But Jacob," she started, but he interrupted her, saying, "It's okay. Trust me," with confidence in his eyes. Sylvie decided to trust him and got right up next to him, following just a step behind. The bridge had many more pressure plates, but all of them only fired arrows at them from various directions, and she found herself grateful that Jacob was able to fully deflect all of them. Finally, the pair reached the end of the bridge, which hung over the end of the abyss, with only one thing in front of them. Just below and forward a short way was a platform that had a simple open box that had 3 or 4 torch sconces resting inside it, and a lever just to the right of it. Jacob was carefully approaching the edge, gently tapping every spot with his foot as he continued looking for more pressure plates, so they couldn't catch them by surprise. He felt quite relieved when they reached the edge without another one going off. "Hey look, we did it," he said with extreme excitement. "We really made it," Sylvie said in disbelief. She grabbed Jacob around the shoulder and pulled him in for an early celebratory hug, and he accepted, tossing the shield into the pit. "Whoops," he said, seeming to not have even realized what he'd done. "It's okay. We just have to get over there and break the chain," Sylvie said. "Yeah, but how?" he asked. She pointed to the lever and replied, "We've got to find out what that does." Jacob was shocked when she simply leaped down to the other platform and pulled the lever, their chain nearly going taut from the distance between them. They were both greatly startled when they heard a massive slamming sound beneath them. Peering over the edge, the pair spotted that walls had literally jutted out and slammed together just a bit below them. Jacob put a hand to his chin, wondering what to do next, but he was surprised when Sylvie called down to him. "Hey, come down here!" Jacob did as he was bid and hopped down to her. "I've got an idea. Set down Mrs. Vidal and grab one of those torches," she explained, setting Robin down close to the wall. Jacob followed suit before completing his instructed task. "Alright, now let me see your end of the chain," she said, holding out a hand. Jacob gave it to her and watched as she dropped his end down the pit and slowly lowered it down. "Now pull that lever again." He did as she asked, starting to see where she was going with it. The walls below suddenly retracted, returning to their original position. Sylvie lowered the chain as far as she could and instructed him to pull it one more time. He did, and they heard a huge smash as the walls collided once more, breaking the chains of love. Suddenly a fire erupted from the chain, slowly climbing its length up to them. "Jacob, come quick! Light the torch!" she said, pulling the chain up as far as she could without getting burned. He quickly ran over and stuck the torch in the flame, gasping with delight when the pink flames lit the torch and extinguished from the chain entirely. "We did it!" he shouted, jumping for joy with the torch in hand. Sylvie was about to celebrate too, but they both jumped with surprise when a hole in the wall opened up, revealing a narrow staircase heading upward. The pair smiled brightly at each other before grabbing Felia and Robin and bringing them up the stairs with them. The stairs led to the barracks at the entrance to the temple, having been hidden behind a secret wall. With great enthusiasm, Jacob ran to the kiln and set it alight with the flame of love. Chapter 11. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Jacob and Sylvie started to cheer in celebration, but were shushed by the lovebird who'd opened the door for them. He squawked with surprise when he saw them carrying Vidal's wife and son, but they didn't spare the time to answer his questions. Instead, they scooped up the great sword and mirrored shield before running off to return to the castle, desperate to bring them somewhere safe. The pair plowed through the snow as they ran back to the castle as quickly as they could, making it there in just a few minutes. The young boy who'd been sitting on the porch was absolutely aghast to see them carrying his mother and brother, immediately flinging open their front door and showing Jacob and Sylvie to their cots, where they could rest comfortably. "What happened to them?" he asked dejectedly. "It's all right, buddy. They're just asleep," Jacob explained. "Sorry, but we don't have time to talk. We've got to go tell your father what's been happening," he added, making Sylvie nod in agreement. The pair headed off like a shot and dashed into the castle, finding themselves surprised the forge was empty. The narrow hallways had still rung with the sounds of metal striking metal, so they followed them into the courtyard to find Vidal just finishing his fixing of the Fernal kiln. He made his last strike on a nail before stepping back from it to check his workmanship as they entered. "Hey, ride hard! We found your wife and son," Jacob called out.
Jacob, Sylvie, you two are back quickly. Tell me, did you manage to light the kilns?" he asked.
"2 of them, so there should be 3 lit right now," Sylvie said with a bright smile.
"Really? Why didn't you light the 4th?" he asked.
"Well, we found your wife and son, but they were pretty roughed up, so we brought them back here so they could rest and get something to eat," Sylvie explained nervously.
"You've mentioned them twice now, and I'm glad they're okay, but you haven't mentioned my daughter. Didn't you find her while you were out there?" he asked nervously.
Jacob gulped and said, "I think we found her, but unfortunately, she's gone."
"What? What do you mean, gone?"
"What happened to her?" he demanded, grabbing Jacob by the arms and shaking him, desperate for an answer. "I mean, she's dead," he said. Vidal stopped shaking him, frozen as the words smacked him with the harsh reality. "We think she tried to light the Kiln of Fear by herself since she didn't have a partner to complete the ritual with. She succeeded, but she set herself alight to do it before throwing herself in the kiln. I feel quite certain that's how she was burned to death. I'm sorry. I know that must be hard to hear."
She really sacrificed herself to light the kiln?
No, that can't be right. I need to sit down," he sickly replied. Jacob and Sylvie were surprised when he wordlessly pushed past them, returning to the forge and taking a seat at the table. He buried his face in his hands with his elbows on the table. "Are you going to be all right?" Sylvie asked sheepishly.
"No, this is my fault.
Lena was only 14 years old, and I sent her to her death. I can't believe I'm so stupid," he moaned as he wept. "Please, you have to take me to her body. She deserves a proper burial. Felia will want to see her. Just one last time." "You may not want to go see her," Jacob said, making him lower his hands and glare deeply at my father. "As I said, she was burned alive. She's somewhat unrecognizable," he added uncomfortably.
"I don't care about that. Take me to my daughter, now!" he demanded, slamming down a fist.
All right, just try to relax. We left her at the Kiln of Fear. Come on, we'll take you to her," Jacob said nervously. Vidal nodded strongly and got up sharply, quickly moving to their sides as they exited the castle together. Sylvie tugged on his sleeve. "But Jacob, we might be leading him right towards Sycamore," she said quietly. "That's a risk we'll just have to take. The man wants to see his daughter again, and I can't bring myself to stand in his way," he solemnly replied. Sylvie only nodded sadly in agreement as they left the castle and started down the road toward the Kiln of Fear. Vidal was faster on his feet than the pair had given him credit for, running ahead and making them jog lightly to keep pace. They reached the encampment in the ruins nearby the Kiln of Fear in only a few minutes, but even as they approached they'd been able to see him. Sycamore was marching from the campsite to a large hole that hadn't been there before, and it seemed he'd kept himself busy by freezing the water spirits solid and dragging them into the pit from their places at the campfires. Sylvie felt a little relieved she could still see the light purple flame burning in the Kiln of Fear from outside, but as she looked at Jacob, her stomach sank. His furious glare was tracking Sycamore across the snow, and his fists were clenched tightly around the handle of his blade, a vicious ripple crinkling his nose as he started moving faster. Jacob ran right past Verdal and straight toward Sycamore, who seemed nearly done with his self-imposed task. Sylvie dashed to keep up with him and grabbed him by the arm, surprising him when she came to a stop. "Jacob, you have to contain yourself. We don't have time for this right now," she insisted. Verdal raised a hand to his chin curiously as he caught up to them. "Let me go. Right now," Jacob practically barked at her. Sylvie was surprised, to say the least. Jacob had never given her an order like that, and he'd certainly never spoken to her with such ferocity. "Focus, Jacob, please. I can't do this without you," she pleaded. Her begging seemed to bring him back to reality, and he looked to her with extreme conflict in his eyes.
"I don't understand. Why are we stopping?" King Verdal asked with desperation in his voice.
Jacob pointed his blade to Sycamore. "See that monster over there? He just killed every last one of the water spirits in this kingdom," he growled. Verdal was taken aback.
"Killed the water spirits? But what about Lena?" he asked with fright and confusion.
"I don't think he had any hand in it, but I can't really say for sure," Jacob explained, seeming calmed slightly by the panic in Verdal's voice. "Come on, we'll take you to her first. But then I'm ending things with Sycamore," he said seriously. Verdal nodded strongly and followed them as the pair led them to the far side of the ruined city away from Sycamore, then led him into the temple. The frost giant didn't seem to notice them when they entered. The place was untouched from how Sylvie remembered it. Lena's body still lay on the floor near the kiln, and as soon as they entered, King Verdal rushed to her side and broke down. He definitely recognized her, even in her burned and macabre state. Verdal was on his knees crying an indistinguishable moan in his grief, his poor daughter laid out on the floor and unresponsive to his despair. Sylvie nervously looked towards Jacob, surprised to find him facing the doorway they'd used to enter. He was furious again, and the hairs on his arms and the back of his neck were standing up. She could see the unyielding rage in his eyes as he waited. Just then, Sylvie found herself frozen when they heard a large footsteps thudding up the stairs outside. Her heart began to race as everything seemed to slow down, but it was only a moment before Sycamore stepped through the doorway, his vision blocked by a huge pile of snow he was carrying. "Stop right there!" Jacob furiously insisted. Sycamore jumped with surprise, dropping the pile of snow as Verdal had his attention taken by them. "You've had your way with the water spirits, but there's no way we're letting you extinguish this kiln." "Extinguish?" Verdal asked under his breath, looking back to the kiln and then down to his late daughter. "Thee peasants knoweth naught of mine own people. They cannot fathom agony alike they hast endured. They feeleth nothing. Meaningless, hopeless lives hath spent consumed by fright," Sycamore argued, pulling the harpoon from his stomach. "Being frozen solid won't help them. All you've done is take away any chance they had at survival," Jacob retorted, blade alight as he pointed it at the frost giant. "Survival? Nay, pointlessness exemplified be life by this pretense. They speaketh only horrors, their dreams only nightmares. They cannot even die," Sycamore shouted back with fury Sylvie hadn't expected. "Seems like you did a pretty good job killing them," Jacob growled. Sycamore scoffed at him. "Dram thine understanding," Sycamore chided. Jacob didn't quite seem to understand, but he knew an insult when he heard one. "I don't care what you think about me. All I know is there's no chance in hell you're putting out this kiln," he spat back. Everyone was surprised when King Verdal stood up and placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder. "You wish to extinguish the kiln of fear. To put out the flame of emotion my beautiful daughter sacrificed herself to light?" Verdal asked, quiet fury burning through his voice. "Thine kilns be affronts to King Ymir. I canst permit their continued combustion," Sycamore said, his eyes flicking between Jacob, Sylvie, and Verdal. "If you choose not to yield in your duty, then you leave me no choice but to destroy you to fulfill mine," Verdal said sternly as he pulled off his cape and gently laid it over his late daughter's body. "Thine threats cannot dissuade mine ambitions," Sycamore said firmly. "Very well. If that's the fate you've chosen, then I won't hesitate to deliver it to you. Come, let's bring this outdoors," Verdal insisted, gesturing towards the doorway. Sycamore only nodded as he turned and headed outside, moving towards the large open space of the once inhabited campsite. "Jacob, Sylvie, you two go and light the final kiln. I'll stay here and stall if I can't manage to defeat him, he instructed before following Sycamore outside. No way! I'm not letting you fight someone like him alone, Jacob insisted, making Sylvie grab him by the arm and yank him away from Vidal. Jacob, let's do what he says. If he can stall Sycamore long enough for us to figure out how to light the last kiln, then there may not be any need for us to defeat him, Sylvie begged. You go. I'm staying here to fight alongside Reinhard, he asserted. But Jacob, she continued to argue. Sylvie, I understand how you feel, but right now, I need you to understand how I feel, he said strongly, cutting her off. I decided to follow you once before instead of ensuring Sycamore didn't hurt anyone, and I'm sad to say I regret that decision. I won't forgive myself if King Vidal is killed out there. Please don't force me to live with another decision I'll regret, he said with great pain and anger. Sylvie sighed and crossed her arms, tapping her foot furiously as she tried to think of a way to solve this dilemma. Before she could come up with anything, Jacob started heading out to the battlefield. She reached out to him, calling, Hey, wait! But he ignored her plea. Frustrated but unsure of how to proceed, Sylvie followed Jacob out to join King Vidal's side on the battlefield. The pair lined up behind him in the snowy field and stared down Sycamore, who'd taken his place standing several meters away. Sycamore started to speak, but as he spoke, runes made of magical energy appeared before his hands, and he touched them both, making his hands glow brightly with the burning blue energy. He made a sequence of hand signs Sylvie couldn't identify as he said, Thine brutish arrogance will be punished betwixt the snow, before pulling his hands apart and clapping them together. As soon as his hands collided, the ground started to shake, and the magical energy drifted from them as piles of snow started drifting from the ground and melded into a pair of beings. One was a giant snow leopard with massive teeth made of sharpened ice, and the other was a mammoth sporting tusks of frozen-over stone, and each beast was the size of a house or larger. They both had eyes of glowing blue, and roared together once they were fully summoned, making Jacob and Sylvie need to cover their ears. Vidal seemed entirely unbothered by the summoning's roars and waved a hand, causing his tree-shaped staff I described earlier to appear before him. He snatched it from the air and stepped up in front of Jacob and Sylvie, flourishing the staff as he said, As I said before, go and light the last kiln. I'll stop him from extinguishing any more here and now. I told you, he's too dangerous to fight by yourself, Jacob said as he stepped up beside him, flourishing the burning blade and entering a defensive stance. Jacob, stop and listen to what he's telling you. He doesn't want any help, Sylvie pleaded, tugging on his sleeve. Jacob ignored her, seeming too focused on the battlefield to pay any attention. She kept trying to get him to stop when suddenly the green flames surrounding the blade turned dark red, and he turned back and lashed out, throwing Sylvie's hand off him and knocking her down in the process. I don't care! He shouted furiously. Sylvie looked to him with great surprise, and he seemed shocked by his own actions a moment, but then he turned his back to her and stayed focused on their enemies. Before she could gather her thoughts and say anything, Sycamore picked his harpoon from the snow beside him and threw it straight at Vidal, causing his summons to charge at the three of them as well. Vidal dodged the harpoon and dashed toward Sycamore, leaping and smacking the leopard out of the way with his staff in the process. Sylvie jumped back to her feet in surprise as the harpoon landed right in front of her, drawing her axe and readying herself for the leopard's attack. Jacob slashed the massive burning blade and cut clean through the mammoth that charged him, but he was shocked when it reformed himself while still coming at him, barreling him over and burying him in the snow. Sylvie blocked the devastating fangs of the snow leopard with the shield and delivered a powerful smash through the beast's head with her axe. But she managed to hop out of the way as it tried to cover her over with snow because she'd seen what happened to Jacob. She found herself unsurprised when he burst from the pile of snow with a furious roar, leaving a crater in the powder around himself where his heat had melted it. She found herself going back to back with him as the leopard circled around and the mammoth reformed itself from other snow close by, not sure what they should do to beat back the invincible summons. She looked to Vidal and found he was swinging furiously at Sycamore, but the frost giant was dodging his blows and slowly moving toward them, likely interested in recovering his harpoon. Jacob said, We need to use elementalism, and raised his hand, but stopped when Sylvie turned back and grabbed onto his arm to stop him. We can't! She shouted, but before she could argue further, he was spraying dark red flames at the mammoth, causing it to start melting. The leopard leaped toward them, but Jacob turned back and blasted it with a furious combustion, knocking it back and starting to melt it too. Jacob stopped spraying the flames, but seemed even more furious when the snow beside the creatures shifted and formed the beasts anew. Sylvie said, This isn't going to work. We have to think of a better way. Like what? Jacob barked. I don't know, but we have to think of something fast, she cried, the snow beast now fully reformed and ready to attack once again. Chapter 12. Igniting Emotion. Sylvie grabbed Jacob tightly by the arm as she yanked him out of the way of a cone of frost breath that spewed from the leopard's mouth. But she was shocked when the pair of beasts turned their attention to Verdal as he continued his relentless assault against Sycamore. The frost giant recovered his harpoon and seemed quite at ease as he flourished it with the pair of summons beside him. Jacob shouted, "Hey!" beside her to try and get Sycamore's or the summons' attention, but neither turned toward them. "They're ignoring us. Big mistake," he added, planting his blade into the ground and putting his hands together. When he pulled them apart, a ball of deep red fire formed between his hands and was growing larger by the second. Sylvie punched him as hard as she could in the back of the head, and he slapped down, face first into the snow. Luckily, it had the intended effect, and Jacob's orb of flames dispersed as he fell. "Stop being an idiot and use your damn head. We can't let ourselves be overcome by the flames of emotion right now," Sylvie said as she pulled him up from the snow. The blade was still burning deep red, but Jacob seemed to refocus as he came to his senses. "But we have to find a way to stop him," he pleaded, still quite pained by the lump on his head. "I know that. Now calm down and try to think of something while I concentrate," Sylvie said, extending her hand in front of her as Jacob got back to his feet. She pointed her axe at one of the beasts. "High dispel," she commanded, but she was flustered when the creature seemed unaffected. Sylvie pulled out her spellbook, flipping through it before pointing at them again, commanding "True dispel," but it didn't have any effect either, so she put it back inside her pocket. Jacob pulled his blade from the snow and took a step forward to start charging in, but he stopped cold when he heard King Verdal start laughing. "Your strength is quite impressive, but I'm afraid it's nothing compared to what my father taught me long ago. I thought this fight would make me hate you, but I must admit I'm surprised to actually need this," Verdal said as his eyes started to glow deep blue. Sycamore seemed taken aback and flourished his harpoon as he entered a defensive stance, his mammoth stepping up in front of him to protect him. Verdal's hair started rising through the air as the deep blue glow traveled from his eyes until it burned from his upper body, then shifted from blue to hot burning green. The buds on his tree staff bloomed into beautiful flowers as the light from his brilliant power shone bright on them, and with a simple wave of his staff, a massive scorching wall of fire burned away from him like a tornado of flames. The fire burned so hot the snow beasts melted, and Sycamore was only barely protected by what remained of his mammoth. Sylvie blocked with the shield and was able to protect herself, but Jacob was entirely unaffected. When the wave passed them by, they were shocked to find the snow on the ground had been burned away, leaving only scorched earth underfoot. Sycamore was shocked to see his summons still only melting, the heat in the air making it impossible for them to regain their forms. Steam was rising from the area all around them, and thunderclouds were forming in the air. "Whoa," Jacob remarked, awestruck by Verdal's hidden strength. "See? He can handle it! Now let's go back to the Kiln of Rage," Sylvie begged. "No way. I'm not missing this," Jacob said, seeming much more relaxed and excited than he had before. He extinguished the fire burning up his blade and looked on with intrigue, making Sylvie sigh to herself. "Does everything always have to be the hard way with you? Come on. We don't have any idea how much time we have," Sylvie said, tugging at his arm. Jacob seemed unbothered by it, letting her tug at him as he watched in silence. Jacob's refusal to respond made Sylvie see a need for more drastic measures, so she yanked on his arm so hard that she hurled him into the air. He went spinning through the air, but managed to right himself with a burst of deep red flames before landing with skill a short distance away. He was about to speak, but Sylvie marched right up to him, pointing a finger at him as she said, "We're going back to the Temple of Rage right now. We have to figure out the secret of this shield and to light the last kiln before this fight is over. If we don't," was all she managed to get out before he interrupted her. "Wait, listen. I might not always be right when I say this, but I've got a feeling this is exactly where I need to be. If you have an idea, then go and try it. But otherwise, I need to stay right here," Jacob said, gentle but serious. Sylvie gritted her teeth before turning back to the fight, desperate to think of a way to disengage. "Why do you always have to be so stubborn?" she demanded, shaking her fist at him. "It's not exactly like there's any compromise between our positions here," he sheepishly replied, wary of getting struck again. "That's not the point," she shouted, making him purse his lips. "You're being pretty stubborn right now yourself, you know," he replied angrily, starting to get frustrated. They were just turning to face each other when Verdal raised a hand and formed a volatile green fireball in it, firing it at Sycamore so quickly that the frost giant only barely had time to dodge and get to snowier ground. Jacob and Sylvie both jumped with surprise at the size of the fiery green explosion that looked big enough to wipe out a small village, and Sycamore seemed quite on edge himself. He grimly said, "Now I understand. Thine hast inherited the will of King Surtur," before starting to perform another sequence of hand signs. Before he could complete them, Verdal formed and fired another violent fireball, forcing Sycamore to stop signing and dodge. He started again, but was interrupted a second time. "Damnable will of fire," he said, making Verdal chuckle to himself. "I was hoping that since we're both descendants of kings from a bygone era, that you might prove to be a challenge. I'm sorry to say that I'm not impressed." "Begone," he said, forming another fireball and launching it with nearly no effort at all. It seemed like Sycamore had met his match as he dodged, but Sylvie and Jacob were surprised to find him weaving signs once again, though these seemed markedly different from those he'd done previously, and he was actually able to perform the entire sequence before Verdal could fire again. Sycamore slapped his hands down to the ground before dodging another fireball, but everyone was surprised to find that nothing seemed to be happening. Jacob raised a hand to his chin and remarked, "He's fast for someone so bulky. I wonder what that was supposed to do. It didn't seem to have any effect." "Look, over there," Sylvie said, getting his attention as she pointed off a fair distance behind Verdal. There in the snow, ice was forming over the top of the frosty ground cover, and more snow was being pulled onto it as the ice continued to grow. In mere moments, the ice had grown impressively massive and started taking a near humanoid shape as it started standing up all on its own. When it stood up completely, they could see the ice giant Sycamore had created looked almost exactly like him, and it stood so tall it was larger than the mountain the castle containing the fertile kiln rested inside. "Behind you!" Jacob called with desperation, unsure how Verdal hadn't noticed the massive figure looming over him yet. The golem smashed a massive fist down on Verdal and Sycamore, but King Verdal managed to hop out of the way just in time. Sycamore was struck by his own attack, but Sylvie felt her heart sink into her stomach when she realized that had been his intent the entire time. The giant returned to its standing position, and Sycamore traveled through the frosty being from its hands to rest inside its chest cavity, right about where its heart would be. Everyone gulped when they noticed Sycamore once again weaving hand signs inside. Verdal didn't waste a moment and bombarded the frost giant with green fireballs at a rapid pace, causing it to start melting as it struggled to maintain its form. But it seemed that Sycamore hadn't needed the creature for battle, and was instead using it solely as a shield to protect him and buy him the time he needed. When he finished his signs, 3 glowing blue runes appeared before Sycamore, and he grabbed each one before smashing them together and forming a shining new rune. He placed his hand on it before the chest cavity of the frost giant he was inside was blasted open, and he fell to the ground. Sadly, this seemed to work out in his favor as Sycamore put his hands to the ground, and a large rectangular mirror of ice rose from the snow, the frost giant continuing to melt behind him. Verdal didn't even hesitate and blasted the mirror with a fireball, but it had no effect. "What foul scheme have you concocted this time?" he asked, seeming on edge. Sycamore was a little out of breath, but started to chuckle. "Thy knowledge will grow in due time," he said smugly, seeming quite pleased he had been able to perform whatever technique this was. "A mirror?" Jacob asked himself, eyeing the mirrored shield on Sylvie's right arm. Sycamore started performing more hand signs, and Verdal sprayed a torrent of green fire at him in response, but the frozen mirror hovered between them and protected its frosty master. When he was finished, Sycamore laid his hands on his chest, and snow was suddenly pulled to him from the ground before forming an entire suit of armor made of ice, surrounding his entire body in frozen plate mail, including his stone harpoon. Without warning, he sidestepped his mirror and made an action like throwing his harpoon, though the actual weapon was still frozen to his armor. As he did so, a long icicle spear launched from the frosted tip of his weapon before more ice coated it over again. Verdal was aghast and just barely dodged before he waved a furious lash of fire at Sycamore. The frost giant stood there, unfazed by his attack. Everyone was taken aback when Sycamore stuck his harpoon deep within the mirror, and as he pulled it back out, it became coated in a thick, silvery substance. Sycamore started to roar as he charged at Verdal with both hands on his silver-coated weapon, so Verdal raised a hand and fired a volley of powerful explosive blasts that seemed to bounce right off the armor and detonate in the snow behind him. Jacob and Sylvie were shocked and moved to intervene, but they were too far away from their arguing to be close enough to help. Verdal blocked the first jab of Sycamore's harpoon with his staff, but he was shocked when the old frost giant smacked the tree-shaped weapon aside and stabbed his harpoon right at his chest. The old king just barely dodged, but Jacob and Sylvie looked on with shock as the silvery goo flew past Verdal before stopping cold in midair and changing directions, launching itself directly into his back. Verdal stumbled forward as the silver suddenly coated him over, and Sycamore only laughed as it boiled and rolled over Verdal's skin. But he needed to dodge as Jacob slammed the Buster Sword on the ground furiously. "What did you do to him?" Jacob snarled as flames of rage flared up on his blade. As if to answer his question, the silvery substance hissed and pulled itself from Verdal before forming into an exact duplicate of him. The silvery copy looked to his own hands and asked, "What is this?" with great fright, and it seemed the original had been turned to stone. Before anyone could say anything more, the silvery copy of Vidal was forcibly sucked into the mirror. The look on his face was pure terror as he stood inside the mirror, petrified and banging silently on the other side, begging for freedom. "Tell me what you did to him!" Jacob screamed furiously, causing the deep red flames to lash out from his mouth and nose with every breath. "His fire burned like Surtur's. The only way mine couldst slay him was to seal away his very essence. Worry not. Mine willst not waste such a power on thee," he said smugly, still seeming a little out of breath. "What did you say?" Jacob asked furiously, baring his blade over his head ferociously as he prepared for another assault. Sylvie knew she needed to intervene and said, "Jacob, get a hold of yourself. He's trying to provoke you." But he only said, "So what?" as he furiously assaulted Sycamore, only to be dodged by the nimble giant. Sylvie said, "Such an idiot," to herself as she watched the frost giant dodge blow after blow. "A peasant such as thee willst never defeat me," Sycamore declared as he jabbed at Jacob with a furious counter. Jacob skidded through the snow as he barely blocked in time with his blade. He retaliated with a lunging thrust that scraped across Sycamore's armor but failed to pierce it. Sylvie leaped at Sycamore's back and slammed her axe squarely down on his neck, but it seemed just as ineffective as Jacob's furious assault. Sycamore whipped around and slashed his frozen harpoon at Sylvie, but she managed to block with her mirrored shield. Jacob took the opportunity while Sycamore's back was turned to deliver a mighty vertical splash to the frost giant, but even the full force of his strength and the weight of the colossal sword couldn't break through his armor. Jacob gritted his teeth and slashed him so hard Sycamore skidded away from them in the snow and mud. "Thine strength be mighty, but thine will is weak," Sycamore gloated, but Sylvie jumped when Jacob stomped a foot so furiously that the ground shook. "I'll show you who the weak one is," he growled, his eyes flashing red, golden, and white at random as deep red energy surrounded his body before bursting into flames and engulfing him in the roaring tongues of the flames of rage. Sylvie knew this was where she was needed and got in his way. "Jacob, calm down. You have to stay focused. He's trying to trick you," she begged. "Trickery? Nonsense. Mine tongue hasn't told falsehood since mine awakening," Sycamore disagreed. Jacob wasn't having it, as every breath that escaped him came with fire fuming from his mouth. He wasn't just furious, he was gone. She could see it in his eyes. "Get out of my way," he said with such quiet ferocity that it sent a chill down Sylvie's spine. "No, Jacob, you're not listening to me. He's trying to make you so mad she started to say, but he interrupted her by stepping up and shoving her aside, surprising her greatly as she fell into the snow. Sylvie gasped with surprise at hitting the cold snow, but before she could say anything, he was already dashing in to engage Sycamore in furious swordplay. "Such a stubborn asshole," she said, hoping he heard her. Sylvie stood up and watched as she tried to figure out what she could do. Jacob was taking the fight to Sycamore, but he seemed totally unable to break through his defense. But her eyes settled on Verdal. First, she found herself staring at the lifeless statue he once was, but as her eyes drifted toward the silvery version trapped inside the frozen mirror, she felt like that was where her answer laid. Unfortunately, just like the mirrored shield on her arm, she struggled to figure out exactly how to use it. She found herself surprised when Jacob managed to knock Sycamore's harpoon from his hand and topple the frost giant in a furious slash before pointing the massive blade to his throat. She was even more surprised when he raised his other hand, gathering a ball of searing dark red flames in his palm. "Any last words?" he asked. Sycamore opened his mouth to speak, but before a single sound left his lips, Jacob furiously fired the ball at point-blank range, causing a huge fiery explosion to envelop them both. When the light of the explosion cleared, Jacob was still standing over Sycamore, but it seemed the flames had melted away his armor. Without any warning, Jacob started building another ball of flames in his hand, but this one was becoming far larger and more volatile than the last. "Halt! If thou killst me, thine ally willst forever be stoned," Sycamore begged, starting to back away as Jacob continued charging his attack. His furious glare only grew more ferocious as he approached the sprawled-out frost giant backing away through the snow. "You think I'll spare you just because you've taken a hostage? After everything you've done?" he demanded. "Jacob, stop!" Sylvie said as she ran up to him, but it seemed he'd already settled on ignoring her. "If thine fires that attack, you wouldst risk the girl's life as well," Sycamore argued, before backing right into a tree. Jacob only sneered at the frost giant as Sylvie got beside him. "She can handle it," he said confidently, before fully extending his hand to fire. But he was completely dumbstruck when Sylvie batted the attack away with her shield, sending it crashing into the large stone wall surrounding the kingdom and blasting through it with extreme force. "Stop this! You're going too far! We have to find a way to save King Verdal," Sylvie said, getting right in his face. Jacob's fury seemed insurmountable, and he didn't respond, the burning fire the only thing residing in his gaze. Sylvie searched his eyes, but when she found only rage and hatred, she shrunk from him slightly before saying, "I thought you weren't going to make any more decisions you regret." There in his gaze, she found what she was looking for. It was only a glimmer of sadness and hope, but it was there, locked behind a wall of raging fire. "You told me you wanted to help Verdal, but is this really how you're going to help him? By letting him die so you can get some petty revenge? I thought you knew better than this," she demanded. He still didn't respond, but she could see it in his eyes. Jacob was struggling so hard against his overwhelming emotions, desperately trying to let it go. Sylvie raised the shield on her arm and held it up to him, making him look deep into his own reflection. "Look at yourself, Jacob Godley! Can you really tell me this is the person you want to be? Is this really the man I love?" she begged. Jacob stared into his own reflection as sadness filled his eyes. Tears welled up and started pouring down his face as he looked at himself, shocked at how twisted with rage his face had become. But then, something unexpected happened. The mirror of the shield started shining brightly, and a deep red flame exited the mirror from its reflection, hovering in the air before them. Sylvie thought fast and pulled the torch from her belt, letting it catch the red flame as the fire around Jacob sputtered and died out. She was grateful they'd found a way to light the flame of rage, but all her focus and attention was still squarely on Jacob. She breathed a sigh of relief when he dropped to his knees holding his head in his palm, seeming like he had a pounding headache. His blade clattered to the ground, the flame surrounding it extinguished. She knelt down and put a hand on his shoulder, but she was greatly surprised when he pulled her into a hug so tight she nearly dropped the torch and shield. Her shoulder grew wet with his tears and stained her jacket, but Sylvie rubbed his back and told him, "It's all right. It's all going to be all right," with more relief than she'd expected. She held him close a few moments before he sucked the snot through his nose and pulled himself from her, pushing himself back to his feet. "Go and light the last kiln. I'll stay here and stall him," Jacob instructed, wiping his face with his sleeve. "I'd feel more comfortable if you went and I stayed here," Sylvie said nervously. "Don't worry. I won't let myself be overcome by my emotions again. I promise," he said calmly. Sylvie got to her feet and looked deep in his eyes as she smiled at her. There wasn't a trace of the insurmountable rage that had been there before, his glare replaced by his green eyes filled with sincerity and warmth. Sylvie recognized those eyes. She knew them well. "But how are we going to save Verdal from the frozen mirror?" she asked. "I'll figure something out," was all he said in response. Sylvie felt a bit conflicted, but she knew if she moved fast, there was a good chance she could end all this here and now. Against her better judgment, she decided to go by herself to light the kiln of rage. She turned her back to the battlefield and started toward the northwest, but she gave pause when Sycamore called out behind her. "Wait! You cannot light the remaining kilns. I beg thee, please desist," he begged. "Why not?" Jacob asked coldly. "If thine thaw these sacred lands, mine people will be for naught," he explained. Sylvie, I think it might have been helpful if we'd understood everything you'd said up until now. I still don't get what he's trying to say, but I think our miscommunication hasn't helped," Jacob said. "Obviously. If I got what he was trying to say, don't you think I would have tried to explain it to you by now?" she asked. Jacob looked to her with grimness in his face before turning his eyes to the sky, seeming lost in thought as he peered up to the frozen sheet that covered everything above. After a moment, they turned back toward Sycamore. "All right, we'll put out this flame if you let our friend go," Then we won't be able to light the kiln, he bargained. Jacob, if we put out this torch then, she started to say, giving pause when Jacob held up a hand, asking her to stop. Sylvie reluctantly relented. Extinguish thine torch afore I release him, Sycamore insisted. No, we'll extinguish it after you release him. Right now, we hold victory in the palm of our hands if we choose to sacrifice Reinhard. I'm willing to give that up if you release him, but you're not in any position to be making demands, Jacob said coldly. What's to halt thee from slaying myself once he's set free? Sycamore asked. What's going to stop me from doing that if you don't? He retorted. Sycamore thought hard for several moments, tapping himself on the arm as he tried to think of a way around Jacob's strategy. After a good few minutes of stewing, Sycamore said, Aye then, ye have a bargain, before forming a long sequence of hand signs and stepping up to the mirror. He pressed his hands to the mirror, and suddenly the entire thing started to melt, but in the ice dripped a viscous silver goo. Once the whole thing had melted, the goo oozed its way to Verdal's feet before snapping onto his body and covering it completely, then changing color until it was the color of his skin and clothing and fading away. Verdal came to nearly instantly and looked at his hands before gasping with relief, suddenly laughing with surprise that he'd truly been saved. Jacob stepped up to him and gave him a gentle push toward Sylvie, and the old man joined her side without complaint. And now, thou shalt keep thine end of the deal, Sycamore said pensively. With a gulp, Sylvie reached toward the tip of the torch with intent to snuff it out, but she stopped when Jacob said, Hold on, Sylvie. I don't like not being a man of my word, but there are times when a man has no choice, and unfortunately, I'm no better. Go and light the kiln of rage. I'll stay here and keep Sycamore from causing any more damage. There's no way you'll be hitting me with an attack like that. With a flourish of his blade, he took up a defensive stance as Sycamore said, Thine double-crossing whelp peasant. I wouldst have done the same thing. Ye son of a bitch, ye got me. Sycamore doubled over in laughter, surprising everyone. Sylvie looked to Verdal, who was wearing a grimmer expression than she'd been expecting, and he only nodded to her. Sylvie knew what she had to do and headed to the kiln of rage alone. She lit the kiln, and when she did so, the shield and torch were forcibly pulled from her hands back to the chest where they came from before it locked them inside once more. Upon returning to the battlefield, she was surprised to find Jacob and Sycamore merely standing there, chatting as if they were old friends. Jacob was saying something about Sylvie when she showed up, and he immediately stopped and changed the subject before she could get a grasp of what. She's a wild one, all right. Oh, hey, babe. Good job getting that kiln lit. You know, Sycamore, I'm surprised you're being such a good sport about all this. One must know when they're defeated, he said bitterly, seeming to have lost the will to fight entirely. So, where's Verdal? Sylvie asked. Jacob pointed up toward the castle where the fertile kiln rested, and they could see the kiln resting through the broken castle wall. Right as he pointed to it, suddenly the sky started darkening as 4 colored flames drifted from the outskirts of the kingdom toward the kiln. Just outside the castle, Sylvie could just barely see Verdal, his wife, and 2 sons, each holding a torch in hand. Each one received a different colored flame. Reinhard received the flame of ambition, Felia received the flame of love, Robin received the flame of rage, and the eldest son they never caught the name of received the flame of fear. When each of the 4 carried a flame of a different color, the fertile kiln started flashing brightly as they approached and lit it together. Jacob and Sylvie were both awestruck as a new bright green and white flame was lit in the kiln. It burned and rolled brightly a moment, but then seemed to become possessed by a force unknown before launching a furious beam of fire straight up into the sky. The beam pierced the frozen barrier in the sky around Yggdrasil's trunk and shattered it. Jacob and Sylvie covered their heads a moment, expecting huge shards of ice to rain down upon them, but when nothing struck them, they looked up and saw greenish-white flames raining down from the sky, melting all the snow and ice they touched. Suddenly, they both froze as their stomachs sank. They turned back and watched as the rain of fire melted Sycamore before their very eyes, turning him into a water spirit like those of his people. Jacob actually cheered and jumped for joy before running to look at the water spirits who'd been frozen over by Sycamore, but his overjoy was immediately replaced by grief as he found them. The frozen spirits had melted just like Sycamore, but unlike him, they continued to heat up until they evaporated. By the time the rain of fire stopped, they were all gone, drifted into the sky as steam on the breeze. Sylvie didn't know what to say. but Jacob was almost entirely taciturn the rest of the day and for nearly a week to come. Sycamore didn't evaporate like the others, left to wander aimlessly as those before him had been doing since who knows when. Jacob returned the great sword to the memorial, careful to find the exact spot it had rested now that he had found a deep respect for its history. Jacob and Sylvie stood in the muddy grass as the moon took to the sky, but then out of nowhere he said, "Come on, let's see if we can go home now." Sylvie asked about Verdal and the others, but Jacob didn't wait around to be thanked and say goodbye. He may have succeeded in his mission to light the kilns, but it was clear it had left a bitter aftertaste in my father's mouth. Sylvie and Jacob ran straight up the bark of Yggdrasil before eventually they passed an invisible barrier, making them simply reappear in Asgard, jumping off and landing at the edge of the cloudy landscape where this had all began. "See, I promised I'd get us home, and here we are," he said, sounding greatly conflicted but beyond relieved. Yeah, you did," Sylvie agreed as she took his hand, glad he'd kept his promise even if it had hurt them both. She was disappointed in the both of them for letting harm come to so many others, but what was done, and they didn't see any way they could atone for it. After making their return, Odin called the pair of them in for a full report. Jacob attempted to accept responsibility for the pair of them disappearing for so long, but Sylvie convinced the Norse king of gods that she was the one to blame. She was forced to do community service in Asgard for a month, but otherwise she and Jacob got off pretty easy. She said she thought Odin may have recognized that they'd had a rough time. Jacob talked very little for nearly a week after the incident, but eventually Sylvie got him to open up to her again, and he returned to his normal self not long after, though she noted he seemed to have matured slightly from the events. Around a year and 2 months later, Jacob got Sylvie pregnant and married her, and then they had me about 4.5 months later. You already know all about that, though. Still, this is the only story my mother ever got to tell me, and it's even more special to me because my father told me his side as well, though with some minor deviation in whom said what and the like. I still think about it a lot, so thanks for asking to hear it. Part of me wonders about a lot of things about that story that I'll probably never have answers to. I've been to Niflheim, but it's nothing like how they described. Unfortunately, I went there centuries later, and although there was a King Verdal, his name wasn't Reinhard. Anyway, we're starting to run short of time, and I'm getting pretty hungry. Why don't we go get a snack and relax with a drink? Alright, everybody. Well, that was Godly Legacies, The Land of Frozen Hearts. If you like this video, please leave a like and subscribe for more. I'll definitely be putting out more audiobooks of the Legacies books for sure. I know I keep promising the main series having audiobooks and not doing it, but just these are like 8 hours plus just recording, and then a lot more work editing on top of that. So I'm kind of figuring it out. I may try doing a professional audiobook for those again. We'll see what happens. But anyway, thank you so very much for watching and for your time. Make sure you stay tuned for the outtake reel here at the end, and I'll see you guys next time. So, thanks for watching. Hope you have a great day. Bye-bye. Sylvie was an absolutely tall... When he saw she was waiting to see what he would do, he dashed off to her left before curving inward and leaping in for a haymaker bathed in flames. That was a hard sentence. No. Fuck, another typo. The noise, light, and fury of the raging battle roared on in flashes that seemed to be what will... The noise, light, and fury of the raging battle roared on... The noise... The fire giant's hands reached down and touched their wound. Stop that. You know I'm recording. If you howl again, I'm gonna spray you. Don't be naughty. Jacob crossed his eyes and thought deeply, his eyes pouring. Your mom has a pretty... Sylvie was just as blown away as he was to see this tiny... Sylvie was just a blown... Jacob flourished his blade and set it alight before charging Chaos and engaging him, barely missing swing after swing as the primordial god dodged his every attack. She was moving to help Jacob, but he was able to free himself now that Chaos was destroyed. She was moving to help Jacob too, but he was able to free himself now that Chaos was When the edges of the half spheres, when the edges of the half spheres of the crystal touched, first you're Mr. Positive, and now you won't even. She crossed her arms and puffed out her cheeks. Frustrated, he'd used her own logic against her. She wanted to tell him to go fuck himself, but thought better of it after finally. She wanted to tell him to go fuck himself, but thought better of it after having finally helped him improve his mood. Damn it. He stood up and drew back to throw, but he surprised her when he dropped the packed snow and snatched the snowball Sylvie tossed right out of the air. Damn it. He stood up and drew back to fire. And their right and left legs were, they were startled when the cow mooed behind them. But after seeing it was just a regular cow, just doing regular cow things, they paid little attention to it. Boy, I can't actually stay on the words on the page. They were startled when a cow mooed behind them. Sylvie slowly listened. Wow. The print on these things is kind of fucked. Don't worry about it. Oh, that's Sylvie. The four of them walked to the door and entered the restroom. Jacob was just starting to step forward too, as his and Sylvie's stomachs growled loudly. Go on, get up there. You're goofy. Just go. It's a blanket. It won't stop you. See? Oh, some nice sun. He made his last strike on a nail before stepping back from it to check his workmanship. Did you find her out there? Didn't you... Damn, another typo. Dropping the pile of snow as Verdal said sternly as he pulled off his keep. I don't care, he said I don't care. No. I don't care. No. Like what? That's a little much. But he was shocked when the old frost giant smacked the... If thou killst me, thine ally whilst forever be... If thou killst me... Gotta have a plane and a helicopter, huh? She wanted to tell him to go fuck himself.
And you kiss your mother with that mouth?